After we explored Elrond's origin and development in Tolkien's writing process from the 1920s, his ancestors and early days in the lore, and the events of the early Second Age in part 1 of this video, we now take a deep dive into Elrond's life during the Second Age. I try to put him into context with other characters of importance and events of that time here in part 2. The next section could be considered a spoiler for the Tolkien-related Amazon show, because it's likely that some of these events will be covered by the series, but of course, in my opinion, they are also widely known among fans of the books, while film fans might only know a bit about the end of the Second Age, which is the War of the Last Alliance and the Siege of Barad-dur. I will also give you a brief summary of the beginning of the Second Age, so we understand the situation and events that will unfold later. I also have some details I want to add before we continue where we stopped in part 1, so I hope it will be interesting for everyone. As always, I try to pronounce names as Tolkien described it, which means that you have to embrace the LotR. Shoutouts again to all the artists who allowed me to use their fantastic artworks: Kimberly 80, Ted Nasmith, Sara Morello, Jenny Dolphin, Niati, Benef, Laura Tolton, Pete Amacri, and a new one, Andres Bertaccini from Brazil. He also has a YouTube channel with speed painting videos where you can see how the art is created. And another new artist, Firat Solhan. Links are in the description. Also, when I wrote the script, the Nature of Middle-earth book was not released yet, but I implemented a few things in part 2 afterwards. But keep in mind that the use of this book might be a bit inconsistent and some aspects from it might not be mentioned. Also, there was a change to my channel recently. Gaming content is now uploaded to my second channel, and here I will from now on only upload Tolkien-related videos. There's also a video explaining this. Check it out if you're interested, and already thank you for the support. After the War of Wrath, which ended the First Age, Beleriand was sunk into the ocean and Sauron surrendered. Out of fear, it's not clear if he had some regret too. The Maiar Ionwe, herald of Manwë, Maiar are so to say the angels of lower rank, commanded that Sauron, who is also one of the Maiar, should return to the west continent Aman to receive judgment. Aman is where these angels live and look over the world. Something similar happened once with Sauron's master Melkor after his first of 2 rebellions on Arda. Melkor was the first Dark Lord and later called Morgoth, which is probably the more widely known name. He was once one of the Valar, that are the powers or angels of highest rank that form some kind of god pantheon. In contrast to Sauron, Morgoth accepted the judgment of Manwë, king of the Valar, but of course he later betrayed the other powers again. Sauron, however, had different plans when he was asked to return to Aman and went into hiding instead. With this, no possible pardon for him was possible anymore. He decided against it and hid in Middle-earth, forging his evil plans. One could ask, why judgment and redemption through the Valar was offered at all? Did Manwë not foresee the betrayal of Melkor and Sauron? In The Nature of Middle-earth, Tolkien explains in a text, the Orsanwe Kenta, that not giving this option and then, for example, not sticking to his word of potential pardon would bring even Manwë one step closer to also become like Morgoth, which I fully agree with. A possible option for redemption after a judgment must be given, and the judge has to stick to his word. It's also remarkable that Tolkien discusses these matters in such depth in some of his draft texts. When the War of Wrath ended, Morgoth of course lost this option due to his first or previous betrayal and was then thrown into the void, and his forces were destroyed or escaped and hid. Some of the men that served the first Dark Lord fled to Middle-earth, and we can read, "And the evil men came among them, and cast over them a shadow of fear, and they took them for kings." Who them means here exactly is maybe open to interpretation. Men awoke in Hildorien in the far east, when sun and moon were created, and Morgoth brought his shadow over them during the First Age. several groups or tribes fled from there, wandering west to Beleriand, meeting the elves, and became known as the Edain, and some of them as the Atanatari, the fathers of men. On their initial escape to the west, not all completed this journey to Beleriand. Some remained in regions that would become important much later, for example The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Some settled in Eriador, becoming the ancestors of, for example, the Breelanders and Dunlendings. Others settled in Rovanion, becoming the ancestors of the Norsemen. Some maybe settled further south, becoming the ancestors of the Hillmen, and so on. And in the Far East, we also still have a group of people often referred to as Easterlings, who potentially lived under the influence of once Morgoth and later Sauron. Same with the people from the far south, and I assume Khand too. Check my video about Hales and the Haladin or the Origin of the Hobbits video for a bit more detailed information on this topic. And if we come back to the quote, it is possible that these evil men who fled from Beleriand at the end of the First Age brought the evil and influence of Morgoth and Sauron over at least some of those people in Eriador, but of course it could also mean some of the other groups. What we see here is an important lesson on how evil works in Tolkien's world. With the defeat of Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, his evil did not simply vanish, it still remained in the world. It was also infused into the world itself, except for the oceans. In the book Morgoth's Ring, Tolkien calls it the Morgoth element. But as explained, there's more to it. It also is in some of the people's minds. The group of men who fought with the Valar, the Edain, were rewarded with a big island to dwell on, and as we learn in some texts, for example in The Nature of Middle-earth and in Morgoth's Ring, were potentially restored to former glory. So their lifespans became much longer again, maybe as long as it once was. Canon can be debated with this for sure, but according to some theories by the elves mentioned in work-in-progress texts of Tolkien, men originally also had those long lifespans, but when they were influenced and oppressed by Morgoth, who probably made them worshipping him as a god in Hildorian, Eru, that is God, shortened the lifespans of men as a result. Some of those texts have multiple versions, and it is even debated if men were not immortal too at one point, but I highly doubt the latter idea. It's a very complex topic in Tolkien's philosophical texts and deserves its own video at some point. What is canon though? The lifespan of those faithful Edain who wanted to live on this gifted island were prolonged again after the War of Wrath. The exact nature of their change of lifespans is just not clear though. Those Edain then became the Men of the West, the Dunedain or Númenorians, and the island realm was known as Númenor. Elrond's twin brother Elroth, who decided to be counted towards men, became their first king. And in comparison to men that stayed in Middle-earth, they seemed like superhumans that lived for several hundred years. In the Nature of Middle-earth book, we also find some details about the migration process to the island. Quote, but the whole process of migration appears in fact to have occupied at least 50 years, possibly longer, and finally ended only when Círdan, no doubt instructed by the Valar, would provide no more ships or guides. This text also mentions some interesting numbers of 200,000 and 350,000 people, and that after 1,000 years it was around 2 million, increasing to a peak of 15 million people at the end of Númenor. The island had the size of 467,000 square kilometers or 180,000 square miles, so a bit smaller than Spain. According to this Nature of Middle-earth text and a text from the Unfinished Tales, the Edain were brought to Númenor by the elven mariners of Círdan, and it took at least 50 years. See my video about Círdan and the history of the elves. The Númenorians on the island were also visited by elves from the west continent Aman, since it was between Aman and Middle-earth. The visitors from the West continent also brought them gifts, and as a result, the Númenóreans developed fast, but they were also taught many crafts during the migration process and I guess also later by the elven visitors. Quote from the mentioned text from The Nature of Middle-earth: "The Edain brought with them much lore and the knowledge of many crafts, and numerous craftsmen who had learned from the Eldar directly or through their fathers, besides preserving lore and traditions of their own." How canon these passages from originally unpublished notes and work-in-progress texts of Tolkien are can always be debated, so if they are not from The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, or The Road Goes Ever On, and maybe Tolkien's letters, but we know that Númenor was pretty advanced later on, and this knowledge and exchange with the elves and their long lifespans and blessing accelerated their development massively. In early draft texts of Tolkien, we find in The Lost Road and other writings, they had ships that sailed upon water and they descended out of the air, or ships that go now without the wind, and many are made of metal. Also guns, it seems. Our darts are like thunder and pass over leagues unerring. Tolkien, however, did not went with this extreme technological advancement and reduced it a bit again, because I assume he felt it was not needed to portray Númenor as advanced. See my video about technology in Lord of the Rings. Still, one paragraph survived, slightly altered, regarding the perception of men from Middle-earth when they met the Númenóreans, and they took the Númenóreans to be gods. In the Silmarillion, this is a bit more detailed. Quote, "For most of the men of that age that sat under the shadow were now grown weak and fearful, and coming among them the Númenóreans taught them many things. Corn and wine they brought, and they instructed men in the sowing of seed and the grinding of grain, in the hewing of wood and the shaping of stone, and in the ordering of their life, such as it might be in the lands of swift death and little bliss. Then the men of Middle-earth were comforted, and here and there upon the western shores the houseless woods drew back, and men shook off the yoke of the offspring of Morgoth, and unlearned their terror of the dark. And they revered the memory of the tall sea kings, and when they had departed, they called them gods, hoping for their return. For at that time the Númenóreans dwelt never long in Middle-earth, nor made there as yet any habitation of their own." Of course, their technological advancement took some time to develop. Only after around 600 years, so around Second Age 600, the Númenóreans were even able to build ships capable to sail back to Middle-earth. This also gives us an idea about what time the last quote describes, if we consider that Númenor started to build small outposts in Middle-earth, depending on the source, around Second Age 750 to 800, and increased their efforts later. In the text from Nature of Middle-earth, we also find a mention of Númenóreans having no weapons on Númenor for quite some time. In part 1 we also briefly talked about Númenor destroying the woods in Eriador and surroundings, which also brought them in conflict with the native tribes of men living there. The Northmen spoke a similar language compared to the Númenóreans, but that was different for the men from Eriador. As a result, it was assumed the Norsemen were their kin, while these others were not. But that was not true. Some of those tribes natively living in Eriador were simply related to a house of the Edain that spoke a quite different dialect or language already in the First Age, but this house ceased to exist, and so this part of the lore was maybe forgotten. The advanced Númenóreans pushed those tribes out of their native land, and they would later become the Dunelandings and Bree-landers, and we know that the cornerstone for many conflicts to come and a long feud was laid here. At this time also the elf lord Celebrimbor with Galadriel and Celeborn founded Eregion, where the rings of power will be forged, except the One Ring. There are different versions of who exactly was involved in founding it. Eregion was a realm of the Noldor elves and founded around Second Age 750. In Lothlorien we also had an elven realm, same in Greenwood the Great, which will become Mirkwood during the Third Age. Who ruled those realms at that time is hard to say because multiple versions exist. Most sense, in my opinion, makes King Amdir for Lothlorien, though he is only mentioned in the Unfinished Tales. In Greenwood it's either Thranduil, which is what Lord of the Rings implies, or his father Oropher, who is only briefly mentioned in the Unfinished Tales. I guess Thranduil is the more canon version here. If elves from Middle-earth visited Númenor before Second Age 600 or even after it from time to time is hard to say. There are, to my knowledge, no explicit mentions. In the story from the Unfinished Tales about Tar Aldarion and his wife Erendis, again canon can be debated, there is a mention of elves visiting Númenor to attend their marriage celebration, Second Age 870, and an implication that elves sometimes rode through the woods of the island. It's not clear if these elves came from Aman or Middle-earth though. We, however, definitely know that elves from Aman visited Númenor, and it seems strange that it's never mentioned that elves from Middle-earth visited too. As a result, it also seems unlikely, as explained last part, that Elrond might have visited his brother, who was the first king of Númenor. It's not impossible though. A reason could be that sailing to Númenor is almost halfway sailing to the west, and maybe elves from Middle-earth feared they would not return because they could not resist sailing to the west continent afterwards. Just my theory. We also learned last part that Gil-galad, the High King of the Noldor elves in Middle-earth, sent a letter to Númenor, Second Age 882, by giving it to the mentioned Aldarion, who visited Gil-galad in Lindon. In it, the Noldor king warns the king of Númenor, the father of Aldarion, of a rising shadow in the far east, which is Sauron, and suggested an alliance. Keep this detail in mind. Around Second Age 1000, Sauron takes Mordor as his realm and starts to build his fortress Barad-dur, which will be completed 600 years later, setting his plans into motion. Also, after Tar Aldarion's rule, the Númenorians neglect the alliance with Gil-galad again, which might have worried the Elven King and his advisors Elrond and Círdan. And this brings us to where we left off in part 1. Some centuries later, Second Age 1200, according to Appendix B, an ambassador from the west came to Lindon, so he claimed. As we can read in the Silmarillion, he introduced himself as Anatar, Lord of Gifts, sent by Aman. It's not 100% clear if he introduced himself as Anatar in Lindon in the Silmarillion, but in the Unfinished Tales this is indicated. But Gil-galad, Elrond and maybe Círdan, he is not mentioned in the passage, had a bad feeling and did not trust him, sending him away, not even allowing him to enter Lindon, but not knowing who he truly was. And they were spot on. It was Sauron in disguise, taking the fairest form he could, trying to manipulate the elves and bring them under his will. In the Unfinished Tales, it is in addition hinted that Sauron sent messengers to Lindon and Eregion even before he came there himself, so he prepared this for a long time. What is fascinating here, that neither Gil-galad nor Elrond nor Círdan has seen the two trees of Valinor. All of them were never in Aman. Being in Aman and maybe having seen the two trees usually makes an elf, in my opinion, see the unseen. I made a detailed video about this too, and what sources for this theory exist. Check my video Seeing the Unseen for more info on this. In the case of Elrond, he has seen the Silmaril of his mother Elwing as a small child. Maybe Círdan saw it too when he visited the havens of Cirion or when he was in service of Thingol of Dorias, see part 1 or the Círdan video. Gil-galad probably hasn't seen the Silmaril, but it's not impossible. The Silmarilli have the light of the two trees in them and emit it. But I think this was not what made the difference here. As said, they did not know who that ambassador truly was, just that something is wrong. I think their foresight and wisdom led them to this wise decision. But Sauron did not give up and tried it with the realm next door, Eregion. Maybe this all happened in parallel, hard to say if we look at the sources. Interestingly, Celebrimbor was born in Aman and has seen the light of the two trees, same as Galadriel, but he did not send him away. However, Galadriel did not trust Anatar, though she did not know who he was, which also speaks for the power of Sauron forming this disguise, that even the most powerful elves could not see through it completely. There is an interesting quote in the Unfinished Tales. He, Sauron, perceived at once that Galadriel would be his chief adversary and obstacle, and he endeavored therefore to placate her, bearing her scorn with outward patience and courtesy. So Sauron had to work for getting the trust of the elves. Lindon also sent message to Eregion not to trust Anatar. The argument of Sauron made against this advice was quite interesting. Quote from the Silmarillion. And they had at first much profit from his friendship, and he said to them, Alas, for the weakness of the great, for a mighty king is Gil-galad, and wise in all law is Master Elrond, and yet they will not aid me in my labors. Can it be that they do not desire to see other lands become as blissful as their own? This is maybe also the earliest mention of Elrond being a wise lawmaster. Of course, at that point he was already far over 1000 years old, but for an elf, I guess, still quite young, probably studying the law of the world and his ancestors. According to notes published in The Nature of Middle-earth, this would be the mortal years equivalent of around age 38, but multiple versions exist and it's a difficult topic. In a way, the lore of Elrond's ancestors covers a big part of the history of the world already. As a result, he probably knew about Sauron. Elrond's great-grandmother Luthien defeated the evil Maya once with the help of the hound Huan, and his great-grandfather Beren was almost killed by the Maya too. In addition, Gorlim, a companion of Beren's father Barahir, was tricked and forced by Sauron into betraying Barahir, so Elrond could have known that the second Dark Lord was a trickster and deceiver, who now, as seen in the quote, tried to sow distrust among the elves. Interestingly, Elrond is not mentioned to be a healer yet. It's impossible to say when Elrond became widely known as a great healer. I assume maybe in the Third Age, because he could use the Ring of Power after Sauron's defeat. In Morgoth's ring, we find an interesting note in the section called Laws and Customs of the Eldar, which explains a belief of the elves, also called Eldar. It should be said that there are two text versions called A and B, and Tolkien abandoned text B, which was a revision of A. Why he abandoned the revision is not clear, and as always with work in progress material, canon can be debated. Here the quote about healing. And the Eldar deemed that the dealing of death, even when lawful or under necessity, diminished the power of healing. So the elves believe that your ability to heal is reduced if you deal death to others in, for example, a war, which was listed as a main reason with hunting. It maybe explains why elf women who did not or rarely go to war were often good healers. However, maybe because there were some war times in the Second Age in which Elrond had to command armies, as we will learn in a moment, and maybe fight himself, he was maybe less active as a healer, though it states that it's just deemed by the elves and that the ability was diminished, not removed. It is also not 100% clear how the elves heal people. Is it magic, or as the text also states, skilled in the law of living bodies? On one side, I think there is some sense behind it. On the other, when would an elf need physical healing? Probably most likely when an elf put himself or herself into a dangerous situation and something goes wrong. This includes wars, hunting, or going on long travels through dangerous territory. Else, I don't see much need for physical healing among the elves, to be honest. So wouldn't it make sense that healers were present during wars? In this way they would be in the war and maybe not participating in the active killing. This could be true for Elrond too, though as a commander of an army he probably had enough other things to do, though he maybe also refined his knowledge of the living body in the war times. There might be an explanation that could make sense too. Maybe this does not only mean the physical healing of the body, but also the healing of the mind. A soldier just coming from war is probably the one who needs healing and not good at helping other elves mentally through tough times. However, this is just an idea of mine, and the texts hint much more at the physical healing aspect. We might briefly talk about this during the Third Age section again, so in the next part, but let us return to Sauron contacting the elves. As explained, Sauron had some success. While Lindon did not even let Sauron inside their realm, the elves of Eregion, especially Celebrimbor, welcomed him, thinking of him as an ambassador of the powers from the far west. This maybe reveals the eagerness of Celebrimbor to reach or surpass his grandfather Feanor, though in some versions he was only distantly related or not related to Feanor at all, but Appendix B of The Lord of the Rings states he was a descendant from Feanor, making this, in my opinion, canon. This was between Second Age 1200 and 1500. As a side note, Galadriel as a character and her husband Celeborn changed a bit over time, which is a topic for its own video. Tolkien increased the power and influence of Galadriel a lot in his later writings. We find some interesting information of this and what she and Celeborn were up to in the Unfinished Tales, but as mentioned, some of it contradicts other writings. Forgive me when I try to piece the information from different, sometimes contradicting sources together, but we have not many other information about this time otherwise. Keep in mind that canon can be debated when I mention the Unfinished Tales in this video, in general, and I try to hint at it as much as I can. As an example for some contradictions, in some versions Celeborn is a Nando or even a prince of the Teleri from Aman, not a Cinder elf. In some versions Galadriel receives a ban by the Valar, and others she decided to stay in Middle-earth herself. In one version Amroth is Galadriel's son, and Celebrian is not mentioned or only mentioned after the war, etc. It is quite complicated. Also, Eregion is a topic for its own video, but here a brief overview under the mentioned context of problems in canon. Depending on the version, it is not clear who exactly founded Eregion Second Age 750, or who had the biggest part in it. In one version it's Galadriel and Celeborn, while Celebrimbor was only accompanying them. There is a version where they all seem more equal, and in another one only Celebrimbor is mentioned as Eregion's lord, but Galadriel and Celeborn are not mentioned at all. For example, in The Lord of the Rings Appendix B and the Silmarillion, which would make this version the most canon. However, it would make a lot of sense that Galadriel and Celeborn lived in Eregion too, and considering their status, plus Tolkien increasing the role and power of Galadriel in later writings, that they participated in the foundation of Eregion. Appendix B also says, Second Age 750, Eregion founded by the Noldor, so it's not credited solely to Celebrimbor either. Why I think Galadriel and her husband being in Eregion makes most sense has to do with the king of Lothlorien called Amroth. Amroth is mentioned in The Lord of the Rings, but in the version where Galadriel and Celeborn are the founders of Eregion from the Unfinished Tales, Amroth is their son. This though is not mentioned in The Lord of the Rings at all, which is strange considering Galadriel's importance and that Amroth himself is also mentioned in The Lord of the Rings. In addition, in a later text, we find that Tolkien created Amdir to be Amroth's father. As a result, Galadriel and Celeborn could not have ruled over Lothlorien from the beginning, and them founding Eregion makes, in my opinion, the most sense here, because one of the main motives for Galadriel coming to Middle-earth and not returning to Aman after the War of Wrath, in some versions there's the mentioned ban, is her wanting her own realm without, as Tolkien calls it, the tutelage of Aman. Quote from the Unfinished Tales: "She, Galadriel, had dreams of far lands and dominions that might be her own to order as she would, without tutelage." So why would she come to Lothlorien under the rule of yet another king of the Sindar? Founding Eregion with her husband and Celebrimbor and ruling over this realm together seems most plausible for me. We find a note that Galadriel foresaw that an evil is at the horizon, same as Gil-galad in Lindon, and concluded that only all three peoples united can stand against that. While, as mentioned, Gil-galad tried to ally with Númenor, Eregion was founded close to Khazad-dûm, also known as Moria, and established a good friendship with the Dwarves, which helped both Noldor and Dwarves developing their arts further. We can read in the Unfinished Tales: "So that Eregion became far stronger and Khazad-dûm far more beautiful than either would have done alone." Interestingly, Noldor and Dwarves have their love for crafting things in common, and we can read that Celebrimbor was a friend of the legendary dwarven smith Narvi. The Doors of Durin are a well-known cooperation between the two of them. In some versions, the alliance with Moria also helped to expand the influence of Eregion over to the other side of the Misty Mountains, reaching Lothlorien under, I assume, Amdir. The capital of Eregion, Ostinethil, which translates to Fortress of the Eldar, was created Second Age 750. As mentioned, due to the texts contradicting each other a bit, it is not clear who played what role when, but Celebrimbor was, according to Appendix B of The Lord of the Rings, Lord of Eregion and the greatest of their craftsmen, and established a group or guild of jewelsmiths called the Gwais Imerdain, which means people of the jewelsmiths. Their influence was great in Eregion, and they had a good relationship with the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, which might be a bit surprising, but the Noldor and dwarves shared their love for the arts of crafting. Galadriel and Celeborn are not listed as Lords of Eregion in Appendix B, and all the information about them are from the Unfinished Tales, which I mix in a bit in the following sections. Now, as mentioned, Sauron disguised as Anatar comes into play. Not only did Eregion let him create distrust between Lindon and Eregion, he potentially managed to also bring Celebrimbor and the Gwais Imerdain against Galadriel and Celeborn. As a result, Galadriel left Eregion at some point, and it seems Celeborn stayed as an unwelcome guest in Eregion, or maybe a bit outside of it. This likely included a household and a small elven army. Again, canon is a problem here, but it seems plausible to me. Originally, I assumed that Celebrian, the daughter of Galadriel and Celeborn, was born in Eregion or maybe later in Lothlorien. Other possibilities were earlier at Lake Nennuial, where, according to the Unfinished Tales, the couple resided for some time, or maybe even when they had their fief in Lindon. However, we have new information in the Nature of Middle-earth book that mentions her birth date to be probably Second Age 300, which excludes her being born in Eregion, because it was not founded yet, and also Lothlorien. Though canon is a concern here, it's the only information we have, and Tolkien seems to have envisioned her to be at least not born in Eregion. If we look into the Unfinished Tales text, the date also implies her being born at Lake Nennuial or maybe in Lindon. Quote, During their sojourn near Nenuyal was born at some time between the years 350 and 400 their son Amroth. As we see here in this version, they have a son, but the birth date of Celebrian would also fit this time, and Celebrian will marry Elrond around 3100 years later at the beginning of the Third Age. If we move back to Eregion and Galadriel, leaving it after Annatar's rise in influence, she interestingly, in some versions together with her daughter Celebrian, might have moved through Moria to reach the other side of the Misty Mountains, while Celeborn, as potentially a Cinder from Doriath, was not the biggest fan of the dwarves, considering the events of the First Age, and would not enter Moria at all. I can also see some conflict potential in this, which Sauron could have used by creating a conflict between the Smiths, who liked the dwarves, and Celeborn, who did not. Sauron knew Galadriel, and her distrust would be his biggest problem to achieve his goals in Eregion, so he had to find a way to push them out. Maybe with Galadriel out of the way, he was able to increase his influence and trust in his arts further inside Eregion. His goal was to teach them to make rings of power. There are lesser rings of power in an unknown number, and the 19 great rings of power, plus of course the one ring, we know from the Lord of the Rings. Under the guidance of Sauron, 16 of those great rings of power were created, and they were sullied or touched by Sauron himself as Annatar. As a side note, the dwarves believe, as mentioned in Appendix A of The Lord of the Rings, that Celebrimbor and his guild might have given one of those rings to his friend Durin III himself, so one of the 7 dwarven rings of power might not have been in Eregion. Quote, "Of this ring something may be said here. It was believed by the dwarves of Durin's folk to be the first of the 7 that was forged, and they say it was given to the king of Khazad-dûm, Durin III, by the elven smiths themselves, not by Sauron." Then, after the 16 great rings of power were forged and the Gwaisi-Myrdain reached the height of their skill around Second Age 1500, Sauron returned to Mordor, and it seems somewhere around 90 years later, Second Age 1590, Celebrimbor completed his own masterpieces in secret, his own 3 great rings of power known as the 3 Elven Rings of Power, which had a slightly different purpose than the other rings, but were still based on Sauron's teachings and design nonetheless. Elrond explains in The Lord of the Rings during the Council of Elrond, "Those who made them, the 3 Elven Rings of Power, did not desire strength or domination or hoarded wealth, but understanding, making and healing to preserve all things unstained. Those 3 rings were called Vilya, the Ring of Air, Narya, the Ring of Fire, and Nenya, the Ring of Water." In the meantime, Sauron created the One Ring in a place called Samos Naur, or the Cracks of Doom, inside Mount Doom in Mordor around Second Age 1600. The volcanic mountain itself was once created by Sauron's master Morgoth during the First Age or before. I assume his power was strong there, and Sauron could create an artifact that would change or heavily influence the fate of Middle-earth itself for almost the next 5,000 years. He forged the doom of Middle-earth. This One Ring was the master ring of the Rings of Power, and Sauron of course did not tell the elves about it. He put into it a large part of his own power and will, as we learn in the chapter The Shadow of the Past. So this ring was a part of Sauron himself. His idea was to bring all those who used a ring of power under his will, making them his servants who would help him to bring his idea of order over Middle-earth. Here is an interesting side note from a late writing of Tolkien we find in The Peoples of Middle-earth. Of course, canon can be debated. The event of forging the One Ring was so huge that it seems the powers became active to start countering this, you could say. According to this source, around Second Age 1600, also the 2 blue wizards arrived in Middle-earth as the first Istari. Those now were the true ambassadors of Aman, who came to Middle-earth to help the free peoples against Sauron as advisors to strengthen the resistance against the Second Dark Lord. I like the idea of them arriving in exactly this time, but of course Saruman, Gandalf and Radagast would arrive much later, around 3rd Age 1000. The two Blue Wizards, though, travelled into the Far East to weaken Sauron's influence on the men of these distant regions, I assume the Easterlings. However, one other person was sent to Middle-earth together with them, and that was no other than Glorfindel, who once sacrificed himself killing a Balrog to save the refugees of Gondolin, including Tuor, Idril, and an around 7-year-old Earendil. As we remember, that is Elrond's father. Glorfindel did not travel into the Far East, but to Lindon, and it is said Glorfindel was sent to aid Elrond and was, though not yet set, preeminent in the war in Eriador. It's very hard to imagine how this first meeting of Elrond and Glorfindel must have been. Elrond met this legendary elven warrior who died in an epic battle against one of the most powerful foes an elf can imagine to save his father and grandparents. Legolas expresses it quite fitting in The Lord of the Rings when he talks to Galadriel and Celeborn. Of all elf banes, the most deadly, save the one who sits in the Dark Tower. I can't imagine what they said, but I'm pretty sure there was an immense respect that Elrond might had for Glorfindel, and maybe over time between both of them, considering that the legendary re-embodied elf lord from the First Age later lived in Rivendell too, and even rode out against the Nazgul alone to help Frodo, probably being asked to do by Elrond. Sadly, there is no more information on this, and it seems Glorfindel, as the Istari later, remained an advisor for Elrond and I assume Gil-galad too. There is no mention if he took an active part in the war and what that looked like. I assume the elves had to fight their battles themselves and he mostly aided them with his knowledge and wisdom. Maybe he was also on some battlefields though. We at least know that he was present on the battlefield in the Third Age during the war against Angmar. In early drafts of The Lord of the Rings, he was also part of the Fellowship of the Ring. If we now jump back to the situation in Eregion and the Rings of Power, I assume that mostly the lords of the elves in Eregion wore those rings, so the leaders and the most influential elves, controlling those would be huge for the Dark Lord, but Sauron did luckily one mistake. He underestimated the elves. Celebrimbor and the others suddenly were aware of the existence of the One Ring and saw the immense danger of their wills being dominated by the One Ring's creator, who was also revealed in the process as Sauron himself, and the elves put the rings off their fingers and would not use them as long as Sauron possessed the One Ring, and Celebrimbor in terror sought counsel. Interestingly, he went to Galadriel, it seems. I guess the relation to Lindon was a bit pressured, and at least Galadriel was sitting in the same boat as him for some time, even though she did not trust Anatar from the start and later left. Of course, also Galadriel knew the situation better and was considered very wise too. This, in my opinion, shows that Celebrimbor saw his mistake and was not overcome by pride. If we compare this to the fall of Gondolin, discussed in part 1 of this video, we see many parallels, but also one small difference. Turgon was warned by, for example, Elrond's grandfather Tuor, who was sent by the Vala Ulmo, but the Noldor king was too proud to take action or change his path until it was too late. Celebrimbor was warned too, actually twice as we learned, by Gil-galad and by Galadriel. And he and his guild did not listen too, but he did at least change his path at the very end. In my opinion, it needs some character to admit your mistake. We don't know how the dialogue between him and Galadriel went, but she also had reasons to react with scorn, considering she and her family were potentially pushed out of Eregion by Celebrimbor and his smith friends. But we know she gave him good advice. She advised him to hide the 3 rings of power. Both agreed it would be best to destroy them, but they could not do it. We can read in the Unfinished Tales, and Celebrimbor went to Lorinan to take counsel once more with Galadriel. They should have destroyed all the rings of power at this time, but they failed to find the strength. This can be interpreted in multiple ways. One would be that it's difficult to destroy the Rings of Power and they had not the power to do so, or they could not find the will to do so, either because they desired the rings in some form or the rings already had some minimal power over them. It could even be that both points were true. We don't know for sure, but we know the rings were not destroyed by the elves and it was never really tried. We only know that 4 of the 7 dwarven rings of power were much later consumed by dragonfire, I assume around 3rd Age 2570 during the War of Dwarves and Dragons, so it is possible to destroy them. However, Sauron was furious that his plan failed and now he wanted the rings back to make use of them somewhere else and take revenge. He knew it would be much easier to bring men under his will, but elves would have been more powerful as servants, and that is why he tried it with the elves in the first place. So he prepared an army that must have been absolutely massive. In the meantime, Celebrimbor followed Galadriel's advice and hid the rings. The 16 or 15, depending on what the dwarves say is true, inside Eregion, and the 3 he sent elsewhere. Vilja and Narja he sent to King Gil-galad in Lindon, and Nenya he gave to Galadriel. Again, we could ask how contacting Lindon went after Eregion turned down the advice of Gil-galad, Elrond and most likely Círdan. If you think about it, Celebrimbor was quite different to his grandfather Feanor in this regard, who would probably not have admitted his mistake and corrected his path. And this small difference in character will make a huge difference and Celebrimbor almost a tragic hero, while the outcome for Eregion will be similar to Gondolin. One could ask, when Sauron's identity was revealed to the elves of Eregion, why did it take Sauron around 93 years to attack? What did he do all the time? In the Nature of Middle-earth, we find an unusual text called Note on the Delay of Gil-galad and the Númenorians that gives some answers to this, but also creates many new questions, in my opinion, which might be why Christopher Tolkien did not publish it in the Unfinished Tales before. Shoutouts to my mod Círdan for this thought. In short, it says that after the War of Ras, Sauron had trouble gathering orc armies because so many died there, and after it, some stronger kinds of orcs were hiding far away and were scattered. For example, in the far east of Middle-earth, there were wild and ungovernable orcs who were not under his control, and the text explains that while he was in disguise in Eregion, he simply could not go there and bring them under his rule. They would have laughed at him in his fair form, which shows that this mission was a huge focus for him and he could not make any suspicious moves, which actually weakened Sauron in a way. And this disguise mission took around 400 years in total. We can read that Sauron's emissaries were active among the men of the East as well. But Númenor also had people in Middle-earth, probably exploring the land, and they potentially told Gil-galad that they saw activity in and around Mordor, which the Dark Lord would have wished to keep secret. Sauron, however, could not risk that they also found out about further activities in the East or his true identity while playing the role of Anatar in Eregion. The text does not 100% explain, though, what its title suggests, why Gil-galad did not preemptively attack the forces gathering there if he knew about activity in Mordor. In addition, Sauron had 1,200 years of preparation time before, and if Sauron would have succeeded with the elves, he would not have needed a war, so there are some questions raised by the text. Only after his true identity was revealed, he could focus again on the East, trying to bring these orcs and Easterlings further under his control and train armies. In addition, the peoples of Middle-earth text, the 5 wizards, is mentioned, which implies that the Istari, the 2 blue wizards to be precise, had an effect there. It further says that there were enemies in the East and 1,000 lands, which could mean the blue wizards, though that is an interpretation in the context of the greater lore. Keep in mind that there are multiple versions of the blue wizards, but in my opinion, if you consider the version where they already arrived during the Second Age, It seems plausible that they might have opposed Sauron in the east, in the regions of the Easterlings, maybe around Rhûn, but in my opinion not in the far south, for example in the regions of the Haradrim. There is no real evidence for this. This detail is strange because the text also mentions the Thous, so who could those enemies in the south be? If we look closer, we notice that it also states, and the southern lands to which he, Sauron, had not yet given sufficient thought. So far the south was maybe not as much on Sauron's radar yet, and in my opinion potentially not really part of his plans yet. The Blue Wizards being active in the south is only mentioned in letter 211 from 1958, at least to my knowledge. Here Tolkien expresses that he is not sure about their story, but suggests that they also fail their mission like Saruman, and maybe even form secret cults and magic traditions that outlasted the fall of Sauron. Just a theory, maybe Tolkien thought about tying this to The New Shadow, the sequel to Lord of the Rings, which he abandoned because their cults are mentioned too. He started writing it maybe in the 50s, and some thoughts went into it as late as 1968 and 1972. Though in these late years he changed the Blue Wizards to being successful again. However, a later text, also from 1972, might even indicate again that all Istari reached Middle-earth at the same time, sent by the Valar at a crucial moment in the history of Middle-earth. Lord of the Rings implies all arriving at the same time as well, in my opinion. Still, all texts have in common that they only talk about the East except the letter 211. Even the Peoples of Middle-earth text from around 1970 mentions that the Blue Wizards were only active in the East. Some parts of the script seem to be missing in the text, I assume because the handwriting was very difficult to read, which is noted in the comment above it. But Christopher Tolkien would have been able to piece together East and South if it was this simple. In addition, the name Romestamo for one of the Blue Wizards in this version means East Helper, which leads me to the impression that Tolkien moved the activity from East and South towards East again, where they also now succeed in this version. We also find the note that they failed to find Sauron's spirit hiding in the Far East after the War of the Last Alliance, which further shows activity in the East. So quite a big difference to Tolkien's vague thoughts in letter 211, which he wrote around 12 years earlier. Interestingly, the Unfinished Tales text from 1954 also only mentions the Blue Wizards being in the East, but not the South. There is even one text where the Blue Wizards perished or were potentially even ensnared by Sauron, becoming his servants. It's, in my opinion, somewhat possible to connect the nature of Middle-earth text into what we know about the Blue Wizards from the 1970 text published in the Peoples of Middle-earth, if we only consider the East. In addition, we have those wild and ungovernable orcs preying upon one another and upon men, whether good or evil, and maybe even some resistance among the Easterlings themselves supported by the Blue Wizards. The nature of Middle-earth text also mentions enemies in the Southern Lands though, which I would interpret as most likely the Númenorians or the Haradrim, who were maybe not under Sauron's control yet, quote, the Southern Lands to which he had not yet given sufficient thought. The text is called Note on the Delay of Gil-galad and the Númenorians, but talks less about Gil-galad and Númenor and more about why it took Sauron so long to build an army to attack Eregion. I think him needing time after putting aside his disguise as Anatar to increase his influence again, which he neglected, and train his armies makes somewhat sense, but the exact reasons are also a bit strange, and as said, he had centuries before he disguised himself as Anatar. And considering how many contradicting sources exist, it's in my opinion almost impossible to form a consistent chronology out of all these texts. As a result, take all this with a grain of salt. It's very work in progress material. What we might learn: Sauron needed that time to build an army strong enough to conquer Middle-earth, and that he was at haste and would have needed more time, which might also explain him failing in the end. Second Age 1693, the war begins. He even had the allegiance of some groups of men from Calenardon and the White Mountains. And Second Age 1695, Sauron arrived with his massive force in Eregion and sacked it. In the Unfinished Tales we find some details beyond what we know from the appendices of The Lord of the Rings. Of course, Appendix B mentions that Gil-galad sent Elrond to help defend Eregion in the same year that Sauron started his attack, which seems strange if Gil-galad knew about activities in Mordor. In the Unfinished Tales we can also read that Celeborn was still in Eregion and also tried to help with his forces. There's also a new text from the Nature of Middle-earth. Celebrimbor fights against Sauron at the halls of his smithing guild, but ultimately is captured by the Dark Lord and his forces. Quote, Celebrimbor, desperate, himself withstood Sauron on the steps of the great door of the Myrdain, but he was grappled and taken captive, and the house was ransacked. Under torment, Celebrimbor reveals where the rings of Eregion are, but not where he hid his 3 rings of power, and is put to death by, I assume, orc arrows. Quote, concerning the 3 rings, Sauron could learn nothing from Celebrimbor, and he had him put to death. His corpse with all the arrows stuck in it is put on a pole and used as kind of a cruel banner by the orcs and is carried through the streets of Eregion. Quote, in black anger, he, Sauron, turned back to battle, and bearing as a banner Celebrimbor's body hung upon a pole, shot through with orc arrows, he turned upon the forces of Elrond. Elrond and his forces were almost overwhelmed and utterly destroyed, even with the help of Celeborn, if not the dwarves from Moria, using the Dwarves of Durin, potentially together with the elves from Lothlorien, attacked Sauron's rear at this time too. It's interesting that the elves of Lorien, some of them Sindar elves who had a feud with the dwarves, would go through Moria and fight with the dwarves, but this also demonstrates how dire the situation was and how powerful Sauron and his army must have been. Due to this attack, Elrond, and I assume Celeborn too, could retreat. Elrond went far back to the Misty Mountains and created a stronghold as refuge, which was called Imladris, or Rivendell, and this is how Rivendell came to be. It was probably also a refuge for all the elves and men fleeing from this terrible war. Some also fled through Moria to Lothlorien. Sauron's forces, though, managed to push the dwarves and elves back, and they retreated behind the doors of Durin and shut them. Shutting the doors to Moria is interestingly also mentioned in Appendix B of The Lord of the Rings. Sauron got, in the meantime, the 15 or 16 rings of power and could guess that Celebrimbor probably gave them to Lindon and Lothlorien. Interestingly, he maybe considered attacking Lothlorien first, but decided against it, which can be seen as a mistake. After conquering Eregion, he decided to attack Lindon because for him it was more likely to find the rings there, and he was right with it. As a result, Sauron continued his conquest through Eriador, and it was in ruins. Because Elrond escaped with a capable force, he besieged Imladris too and had to split his army to contain Elrond and his forces there. Now we come to the 10,000 IQ move. Gil-galad wisely asked Númenor for help long ago. Some were already there and prepared for the war according to the Unfinished Tales, but Númenor's reinforcements or main forces were still late, and Sauron reached the line of the river Hlun and summoned more forces from the southeast, also attacking Tharbad. It's described that it was only lightly held. It was looking grim for Lindon. Despite Sauron already splitting his army, it was still too powerful. But then the Númenorian forces under Tar Minastir, the king of Númenor of that time, arrived with a very powerful host in Lindon. They also sent ships with troops under Admiral Kiriatur over the Gwaaslo, the Grey Flood, around Vinyalonde, which is likely Londdair, to intercept Sauron's retreat. With these combined forces of elves and men at Lindon, Sauron was pushed back and barely escaped. After a slaughter in Sarnford and his forces being strengthened again in Tharbad, Sauron then noticed that he had the army of Admiral Kiriatur in his rear, which led to the Battle of the Gwaslor, one of the last battles in the War of Elves and Sauron, where the Dark Lord's forces were utterly defeated. He escaped with a small host, but was again assailed in the east of Calinardhon again. Sauron managed to very closely escape this last encounter with just a few bodyguards and retreated to Dagorlad in front of Mordor. Then the forces of Gil-galad went north. Only his forces are mentioned in the unfinished tales. It's not clear what the Númenóreans did, but I could imagine they would help the twin brother of their first king too. The part of Sauron's host that was still besieging Imladris was now attacked by Gil-galad's forces from behind and Elrond's forces breaking the siege from the front. As you can imagine, the orc army was destroyed. It's possible that maybe some orcs and maybe trolls fled north into the mountains, but that is just my speculation. My idea is that this mountain area will have some orc and troll activity during the Third Age, and this might be a first foundation for it, but there are also more wars in the Third Age that could explain this activity too. And with this ended the War of Elves and Sauron. One could argue the Free Peoples won, but the whole region was in ruins. Not much was left of Eregion, and the elves were weakened in this area too. Sauron escaped and could grow armies again in Mordor. His position was not the best, but also not the worst, and he got 15 or 16 rings of power out of it, as he wanted, which would prove to be very powerful. I think would he have attacked and destroyed Lothlorien with full force first, he could have maybe achieved even more, especially later on. At this time, I think after the war, a council was held around Second Age 1701. This could be considered a predecessor of the White Council we know from the Third Age, but keep in mind all this is unfinished tales material. Who the council members were is not known, but Gandalf and Saruman were not there yet, and we only know Gil-galad gave his ring Vilya to Elrond there and made him his vice-regent in Eriador. So both of them must have been part of it. My guess for other members besides those two would be Círdan, Galadriel, both members of the Third Age White Council too, and Celeborn, who fought with Elrond, and maybe Glorfindel. I would argue making Elrond vice-regent in Eriador strengthened his position as being a potential successor of the king too. The council knew Sauron was still there, and he had the One Ring and the Rings of Power, which made him still a great threat. It was also decided that Eregion would not be rebuilt and Imladris would become the new stronghold in Eriador, guarding the pass over the Misty Mountains. From all of this we can observe a few things. Elrond was a lawmaster. One could ask, who needs a lawmaster? I think beyond preserving cultural identity, it also preserves history and gives the chance to learn from past mistakes, especially if you are also in parts a witness of this history yourself. It's not a cryptic note from some distant ancestor of old you never knew, but for Elrond and the other elves, it was their own past. As a result, a few things went different. Feanor was influenced by Morgoth early in Aman, which resulted in pride and conflict between Feanor and his half-brother Fingolfin, and maybe also the other half-brother Finarfin, Galadriel's father. Not falling for Sauron in disguise and not accepting his advice was crucial here. Also, Gil-galad and his advisors, Elrond and Círdan, somehow found out that Sauron is active in the east and they asked for help. Elrond and Círdan were both known for their ability of foresight. Remember Idril, who saw the trouble on the horizon building an escape tunnel early? Just as a small hint of terminology, I use the term advisors here for a lack of a better term to summarize their position. It's not an official term. Listening to advice and initiating the right steps early on, asking for help, not falling for the schemes of the Dark Lord and not starting a feud with others, for example the Dwarves, were the key to success here. Of course, it did not went ideal because Eregion fell for Sauron in disguise, and that is why it was very close at the end, but at least Eregion saw its mistake, tried to prevent the outcome, asked for help again, and also did not fall for other mistakes like ending their good relationship with the dwarves, which made a difference at the end. Though all of this still ended in the complete destruction of Eregion and Celebrimbor's death, but not all was lost. I find this a very interesting development, with some more nuances. Elrond's ancestor Thingol and the dwarves were ensnared by the dreadful doom of the Silmarillion. It led to greed and pride and resulted in a feud that would last until the end of the Third Age, and Thingol was also warned multiple times but did not listen. Elrond and Gil-galad never let an artifact of doom come to them. They recognized it in advance. As a result, a deeper feud did not happen. If we imagine what if the dwarf and elves would have extended their feud, Elrond maybe would have not survived. If Eregion would have created another situation like in Doriath, where dwarves and elves once worked together and then started killing each other, things would have become grim. Maybe this is why Tolkien wrote the idea of Celebrimbor gifting one of the rings to Durin into Appendix A of The Lord of the Rings. The elfsmith and his guild shared, avoiding conflict and strengthening their friendship. That is why I like this idea a lot. Of course, some details are different. The Silmarillion came from outside to Doriath and were not created within it. I also think this might be a reason why Elrond always welcomed the dwarves in Rivendell. He and Galadriel maybe agreed on that only all three peoples of Middle-earth combined can stand against Sauron. Celeborn can be seen as a contrast here, because he never was a big fan of the dwarves, but it seems he at least did not actively oppose or sabotage this friendship we could see in Eregion, and, for example, apologizes to Gimli in Lord of the Rings for his harsh words. In addition, Imladris maybe followed the tradition of Eregion. At least one legendary artifact was forged or reforged in Imladris too, which is of course Andoril, and in this context Narsil was forged by the legendary dwarven smith Telchar, and dwarves and men visited Rivendell and found hospitality, advice and refuge there. It seems strange that Eregion was not rebuilt though, but maybe after the war there were not enough elves left for this. In the extended edition of the films we see the ruins of Eregion when the Fellowship travels to cross the Misty Mountains over the Redhorn Pass. If we come back to the council and its members, there is another hint. What supports the idea of Galadriel being at the council is that we can read that she and Celebrian, her daughter, came to Rivendell to see for Celeborn at this time too. One could assume the council is held in Rivendell, but we don't know for sure where it was held. It must be noted though that in this text, which is the only source for this council, Amroth is still Galadriel's son, who stayed back in Lothlorien. So one could argue the canon here. Also, Gil-galad giving Vilya to Elrond is different in other texts too, but I think a council makes sense, as it makes sense for Elrond being promoted, you could say. At the end, we know Elrond will get the ring anyway. According to this text, it is also here where Elrond saw Celebrian for the first time and fell in love with her, but said nothing at this time. So for Elrond, this must have been an interesting time. From almost being murdered by Sauron in a terrible war in which the elves almost being pushed to complete defeat, to being promoted vice-regent and falling in love, all in a relatively short time. Maybe he felt it was not the time for romance yet and that he needed to process a bit what happened, which is maybe why he said nothing. Just my speculation. If we consult Nature of Middle-earth, it might also have to do with being in the wrong life cycle. Again, Canon is a problem with the source for their meeting, but we know he must have met Celebrian at some point, and this point in time seems very plausible. Elrond also became the Lord of Rivendell, and I assume Glorfindel, if he was there yet, came with him because the text explicitly states that he came to the aid of Elrond. For sure did Glorfindel not sit in Rivendell all the time and traveled around instead, but I guess it became his home. At least at the end of the Third Age it seems to be. However, Imladris or Rivendell is established and Elrond is now the lord of this place, probably as lawmaster storing records of the past and the lore there. We know from the prologue of Lord of the Rings that Bilbo used all sources available to him in Rivendell, both living and written, for his parts of the Red Book of Westmarch. After all these details, we fall into an interesting era we don't have that much information about. For sure, the elves knew that Sauron had 15 or 16 rings of power and that he was still a threat. Of course, we can read in the Silmarillion about the 3 elven rings of power. Of all the elven rings, Sauron most desired to possess them. And in Appendix B, we find the note for Second Age 1800. From about this time onward, the Númenóreans begin to establish dominions on the coasts. Sauron extends his power eastwards, the shadow falls on Númenor. Sauron is active in the east and even manages to extend his power, I assume get more influence over, for example, the Easterlings. At the same time, the Blue Wizards are active in the east to counter that. However, the west of Middle-earth, including Rivendell and Lindon, seems to have some peace and try to rebuild, while Númenor, I assume, established maybe encampments or harbors, etc. to control the coasts. It's not really clear because Vignalonde and Tharbad were already there and we don't know too many other Númenorian harbors in that region. Pelargir is built later by the Faithful, when Umbar was created or maybe taken over by the Númenóreans in the South is not clear either, but maybe in that time too. But also something changed in Númenóreans' foreign politics, which is connected to the line "The shadow falls over Númenor." We can read in Appendix A, "Moreover, after Minas Tirith, the kings became greedy of wealth and power. At first, the Númenóreans had come to Middle-earth as teachers and friends of lesser men afflicted by Sauron, but now their havens became fortresses, holding wide coastlands in subjection. Atanamir and his successors levied heavy tribute, and the ships of the Númenórean returned laden with spoil. So the next kings of Númenor became greedier and put men in Middle-earth living in their dominion under heavy tributes, extracting treasures from Middle-earth. A huge contrast to what we read earlier, where they were teachers and revered as gods. Considering that they mostly controlled the coastline, this might primarily indicate Umbar and maybe Vignalonde. It's not clear how many non-Númenórean men lived around those harbors, but of course it's possible that a population grew there, especially Eriador was destroyed and people maybe searched new places to settle and live in safety. I also want to hint at an unusual text published in Peoples of Middle-earth called Tal Elmar. It's an unfinished and abandoned little story of Tolkien that is about the perspective of men from Middle-earth on the Númenóreans. These men in the story live in a town somewhere at the west coast of Middle-earth, I assume. Where exactly, we don't know. It would go too far to discuss it here, and I just want to mention it, but it also hints at Númenóreans attacking the coast to plunder or to make settlements, though fitting it into the chronology is also difficult. It might play much later in the Second Age. Another interesting place I want to briefly mention is Dol Amroth, but it's a complicated topic for an own video. During the late First Age, some seafaring Sindar elves escaped with Círdan and sailed further than the Isle of Balar, where Círdan had a stronghold or refuge camp. They sailed to where we much later would find Gondor and settled there, creating a place called Ethelond, meaning Elf Haven. Then, according to the unfinished tales, after the destruction of Eregion and after uniting in Rivendell, where Elrond saw Celebrian for the first time, Galadriel, Celeborn and Celebrian, in this version of the text, Amroth is still their son, went to a region called Belfalas, close to Ethelond, and dwelt there. Their son Amroth would visit them from time to time and bring Nandor elves from Lothlorien with him. Maybe some accompanied Galadriel and Celeborn initially too, and maybe some of the elves from Ethelond went there as well. And so this place grew and became Dol Amroth, meaning the Hill of Amroth. However, as explained, Amroth is in later texts not their son anymore, and we are back at the canon discussion. Still, this place is mentioned in The Lord of the Rings, and it's called Dol Amroth in it too, meaning the Hill of Amroth. On top of that, the connection of the elves in this place and the later story of Amroth, who lived there, is referenced there as well. As a result, it seems very plausible that Amroth did go there at some point, and so it was named after him. Maybe he went there as son of Amdir instead. If Galadriel and her family went there too, it's hard to say. Either that or they moved to Lorien and stayed there. Later, we don't know when, a Númenorian noble family of the Faithful, we come to that in a moment, settled in this region too. I can't say though if it was this time or much later in the Second Age. The story is chronologically a bit confusing with all those different sources. I just wanted to mention it for further confusion. What Elrond thought about all of this is not known, but he and Gil-galad must have known about who settled where while trying to have an eye on Sauron's activities and not wearing their rings of power. Same for Galadriel, while Sauron had the one ring. It seems Sauron managed to hide from their eyes because we find no mention about how, when and to whom he gave his 15 or 16 rings of power, which is pretty surprising. As a result, the identities of all the Nazgul but one are not known, and we don't know which dwarven lords got a ring of power except for one, but around this time Sauron must have gifted his rings of power because we can read in Appendix B, Second Age 2251. About this time the Nazgul or ring race, slaves of the Nine Rings, first appear. It's not clear how long it took for the rings and Sauron to turn these 9 men into Nazgul, but it probably took some decades, maybe a century or more, we don't know. The Silmarillion gives us some descriptions of this. Quote, "Those who used the 9 rings became mighty in their day, kings, sorcerers, and warriors of old. They obtained glory and great wealth, yet it turned to their undoing. They had, as it seemed, unending life, yet life became unendurable to them. They could walk, if they would, unseen by all eyes in this world beneath the sun, and they could see things in worlds invisible to mortal men. But too often they beheld only the phantoms and delusions of Sauron, and one by one, sooner or later, according to their native strength and to the good or evil of their wills in the beginning, they fell under the thraldom of the ring that they bore and under the dominion of the one, which was Sauron's. And they became forever invisible, save to him that wore the ruling ring, and they entered into the realm of shadows." It was a process and probably took time, especially the line, "they had, as it seemed, unending life," could hint at them living longer than a human life. Another possibility to observe this would be them not aging too, or both. Tolkien words it carefully in the Silmarillion who 3 of those 9 were. Quote, "It is said that among those whom he ensnared with the 9 rings, 3 were great lords of Númenorian race." It is said, so it's a rumor, maybe only a theory. From the unfinished tales we only know one name of the 9, Khamul, the Black Easterling. Pronunciation is not clear to me, it could be Khamul or Khamul. In Adunaic and Orcish names, the KH becomes a CH sound, as in German Bach. In Dwarvish it's K with a small H sound. The name is of course not Dwarvish, but it's in my opinion not Orcish either. Could be Black speech, which is in theory spoken by orcs, but there are actual Orcish tongues too, and Black speech is not explicitly mentioned in the description of this sound. It could be an unknown language of the Easterlings as well. We don't know, and I like Khamul better, so I go with that, but Khamul could be correct too. Where the other 5 Nazgul are from, or who they once were, we don't know. For the 3 Númenorian ones, I would assume they lived in Middle-earth. I can't imagine that Sauron secretly entered Númenor to give them the rings at that point. We are talking of a time around the year Second Age 2151, 100 years before the Nazgul appeared, I guess, maybe a bit later, or likely even earlier considering the long lifespans of the Númenorians. I personally theorize that Umbar and surroundings might have been a good place for Sauron to seek contact and give the Rings of Power to those 3 Númenorian lords, because else he would have to travel unseen far into the lands of the elves again, so enemy territory from Sauron's perspective. Umbar was closer and also closer to territory he controlled and had allies within. Maybe he even had influence on the Haradrim too, because, as mentioned, Númenor put heavy tribute on the people close to their settlements, so Númenor was for sure not that popular, and considering that Umbar might have been controlled by Númenor, that would mean the Haradrim, the people of the far south, were affected by those tributes too. Númenor was so advanced at this time that no one would dare to stand against them in open conflict, not even the Dark Lord. It's of course also not clear if Sauron gifted the rings in person or sent servants. His command structure in Mordor from this time is completely unknown, and as said, this must have happened in secret, else the elves would have known about it. Gifting the ring to an Easterling lord or king in the case of Khamul was much easier though. Maybe he also gifted some rings to the Haradrim and the Variag, men from a mysterious region or land called Khand, southeast of Mordor. Maybe he even reached out to the Norsemen, we don't know, and one can form all kinds of theories here. When it comes to the dwarves, we know that Durin III and his heirs had one of the 7 rings of power. There are 7 houses of the dwarves, so it makes sense to assume that every house got one ring. The house of Durin is the house of the Longbeards. In the Silmarillion we find the following hint. It is said that the foundation of each of the 7 hordes of the dwarf kings of old was a golden ring. So there are 7 hordes, maybe 1 for each house. Again, we don't know, which makes sense because the dwarves kept those rings secret. At least that was the case for the Ring of Durin. Quote from Appendix A. But the possessors of the Dwarven Ring of Power did not display it or speak of it, and they seldom surrendered it until near death, so that others did not know for certain where it was bestowed. I could imagine this was similar with the other Dwarven Rings of Power. The dwarves always like to keep something secret, however, we do not know how they received them. I read the theory that Sauron maybe met with the lords of the 7 houses in Gundabad. Gundabad is a special and culturally important place for the dwarves, and we can read in Peoples of Middle-earth that the dwarven houses in the early ages often held assemblies of delegates at Mount Gundabad. In times of great need, even the most distant would send help to any of their people. This includes the Second Age, I guess, but we can also read in Peoples of Middle-earth, for though Moria remained impregnable for many centuries, the orcs reinforced and commanded by servants of Sauron invaded the mountains again. Gundabad was retaken, the Ered Mithrin infested, and the communication between Moria and the Iron Hills for a time cut off. It seems there might have been a time when Gundabad was conquered by Sauron's forces again, and in the context of this passage of the same text, this was during the Second Age, close after the fall of Eregion. The time is mentioned 2 sentences before, quote, "The Second Age had reached only the middle of its course, circa Second Age 1695, when he, Sauron, invaded Eriador and destroyed Eregion." The mention of commanded by servants of Sauron could mean the Nazgul, but of course Sauron had other servants too, and I assume they would have been named here otherwise. I would argue this was around the time when giving the Rings of Power to men and dwarves, and as a result, Gundabad can't be the place where Sauron met with the Dwarven Lords, because it was conquered by Sauron, which implies being at war with the dwarves. Canon can be debated, but both information are at least from the same text, and there are no contradicting statements from the main sources as well, as far as I know. The question is simply, how long was Gundabad occupied, and was it at that time Sauron gifted the Rings of Power? I have no better idea for this, but to me it seems this theory is, with these information in mind, very unlikely. Maybe he just visited them in disguise and gifted them the rings. Maybe they were brought to them by a messenger. I think, though, it was done quite secretly. Somehow, though, it must have become known that 7 rings were gifted to the dwarves and 9 to men. We know this from the ring verse we find in Lord of the Rings in the chapter The Shadow of the Past. There Gandalf describes it as a verse long known in elven lore. The elves of course knew about their rings. Seeing the Nazgul, they could have assumed that Sauron gifted 9 rings of power to men, but how did they know about the 7 rings of the dwarves? Another guess: foresight, use of a Palantír. They might have known only about 1 in case it was gifted to Durin III by Celebrimbor. I think this will remain a mystery, and we also have no clear date for when the verse was written or when those rings were gifted. We know somehow dwarven lords, or dwarf kings as Gandalf described them in Lord of the Rings, possessed 7 rings of power at some point after the fall of Eregion. Looking into the texts, there's a ton of uncertainty here. It's not even clear that 7 dwarf kings each possessed a ring, though that seems to make the most sense and is the common understanding. We only know there were 7 rings possessed by dwarf kings, and the Silmarillion mentions 7 hordes. The number of kings is not specified. Interestingly, the number of men is also not specified to 9 men in some texts, but we know there are 9 ring race. As a result, I can see how this is the common understanding. Of course, for the dwarf rings we have 7 houses and 7 hordes, which makes this very plausible too. I could sadly not find more useful information in the text though. We also know that the Rings of Power did not affect the dwarf kings, quote from Appendix A, but they were made from their beginning of a kind to resist most steadfastly any domination. Though they could be slain or broken, they could not be reduced to shadows enslaved to another will, and for the same reason their lives were not affected by any ring to live either longer or shorter because of it. So the effects of those rings were not present at all for dwarves, only one thing changed. The only power over them that the rings wielded was to inflame their hearts with a greed of gold and precious things, so if they lacked them, all other good things seemed profitless, and they were filled with wrath and desire for vengeance on all who deprived them. Also, we can read again in Appendix A in the chapter Durin's Folk that according to Thorin Oakenshield's grandfather, Thror, the ring needed gold to breed gold. I interpret this as it helped to make good business decisions, which of course needed an initial investment instead of magically producing gold out of thin air. It's not clear if Thror was aware that it was the last ring in dwarven possession, but I think that is very likely. However, as explained, it is not clear how the dwarves got into possession of the rings. They would have not trusted Sauron, which makes me curious how and when they got them. The Dark Lord probably waited until the dwarves who remembered the war died. The elves could have been unaware of that for some time too, and then only later found out about it. With this, we are getting closer to the end of the Second Age, and I will skip a bit over the part about Númenor, because we covered them in other videos already. For example, the video about Aragorn and the video about the White Tree of Gondor and its lore. As you already noticed, this part of the Second Age has a lot of blank pages and information is not as detailed for the next 1000 years after the Nazgul appear for the first time. As mentioned, in the meantime, a shadow fell over Númenor, Second Age 2251. The Númenorians became, in parts, more and more jealous of the elves and their immortality and neglected the alliance with the elves. This led to an inner conflict in Númenor, which at the end of it led to a split into kingsmen and faithful, men being banned from entering Aman, which the Númenorians tied to not being immortal, was the topic in this context, which Númenor used to antagonize the Valar and also the elves, while the kingsmen went with the views of the king distancing themselves from the elves and even Aman and Eru. The faithful had the opposite view, being faithful to Aman, Eru and wishing for a good relationship with the elves. Some of the faithful might have desired immortality too, but they would not give up their core beliefs. The faithful would not declare Aman and the elves their enemies. I should note that it's not 100% clear when these two groups formed. In Appendix B, we can read that the harbor city Pelargir became the chief haven of the faithful Númenorians in Second Age 2350, so I assume they existed at that time already and maybe even earlier. In addition, we can read that the division in Númenor began when the Nazgul first appeared, Second Age 2251. It's not clear if they had an influence on this process, considering some of the Ringwraiths were Númenorians, but one could argue that Sauron either abused this or even had a small influence on this development. What Elrond and the elves did at this time, we don't know, but they probably noticed an increasing hostility towards them from Númenor. Considering that Elrond's brother was the first king, also taking a Quenya name as king, which became a tradition for the kings, and seeing this development with the Númenorian kings of this later time even stop taking Quenya names, most likely worried him and Gil-galad greatly. One Númenorian king had a mother who was a faithful and raised him accordingly. He took a Quenya name again when he became king, Tar Palantír, and tried to move Númenor back to the faithful path. Sadly, he failed and was met with a bit of rebellion, but remained king. He also looked to the west for elven ships to return, but that never happened. After his death, his daughter Tar Miriel became queen, but her cousin usurped the throne by forcing her to marry him against her will. He became the last king of Númenor, Second Age 3255, and is a very well-known figure. It's of course no other than Ar-Pharazôn. Of this detail in the story, multiple versions exist. In some she married him freely, but in the Silmarillion he marries her against her will. At this point, all was lost. The elves' view on the new king is not really mentioned. We know that in the past some faithful, let's say secretly, sailed to Gil-galad for advice. There's for example a mention in the Silmarillion, because they were under a lot of pressure and later even persecution in Númenor. It's not clear if they maintained this while Ar-Pharazôn was king though. I think the advice could have been leave Númenor ASAP. Sauron became powerful over time and maybe tried to provoke Númenor, calling himself King of Men. This made Ar-Pharazôn angry and he decided to claim this title himself without counseling anyone but himself. So he ordered to build a gigantic fleet and came for Sauron once everything was ready. He landed in Umbar and traveled for 7 days, north I assume. There he built his camp and challenged Sauron, who was surprised by the power of Númenor and knew that he could not win this battle. Not even his most powerful servants would stand a chance against the Númenorians. Maybe Sauron changed his plan, or it was his plan all along, and surrendered to the king. His plan involved doing what he was best at. And so Sauron with his one ring was taken prisoner and brought to Númenor, which was what Ar-Pharazôn planned to do when he thought about attacking Sauron initially. It also shows how powerful this army must have been when Sauron with the One Ring seems to not see a good enough chance to defeat his foes with his armies. Sauron, though, is a deceiver, and he managed to rise in rank from prisoner in Second Age 3262 to advisor of the king over the decades. He convinced Ar-Pharazôn, as he grew older, that he should claim immortality from Aman. And Second Age 3310, Ar-Pharazôn started building the largest sea fleet the world has ever seen. In the meantime, Sauron convinced the Númenóreans to worship Morgoth, becoming something like a high priest of Númenor, and on top of that, a Morgoth temple was built, where, at least in some versions of this story, human sacrifices were made, of course usually faithful. Nimlos, the white tree of Númenor, was cut and burned there too. It was prophesied that the death of the tree would mark the end of the line of kings of Númenor. You can see by now that this won't end well. However, the grandson of the leader of the faithful would sneak into the garden of the king's court and stole a fruit of Nimlos. You might have heard his name, Isildur, who was also from the line of Elrond's brother Elros, but there was still an old law in place, Second Age 700, where female descendants could not inherit the throne. As a result, Tar-Mineldur became king instead of his older sister. He was the only male, while having two older sisters. This law changed later again, and there were also some ruling queens of Númenor as a result. Isildur was born 2500 years later and is a descendant of this oldest sister Silmarillion, and as a result also a direct descendant of Elros too, but the claim for the throne for this line was of course lower after Tar-Mineldur became king. The descendants of this line, the lords of Andúnir, had once a very high position in Númenor too, maybe second to that of the king, having a silver scepter of their own as symbol of their status and power. See a footnote in Appendix A of The Lord of the Rings. And were members of the Council of the Scepter, according to the Unfinished Tales. These lords later secretly helped the faithful and, at the end, even became leaders of the faithful themselves, which of course made them enemies of the king. The leader of the faithful when Ar-Pharazôn was king was Amandil, the father of Elendil, and the grandfather of Isildur. However, as mentioned, Isildur now stole the fruit of the white tree, was seen, fought his way out, got wounded, and at the end narrowly escaped without being recognized. He managed to come back to the faithful with the fruit, but collapsed from his wounds when he arrived. The fruit was planted in secret and blessed by Amandil. When a first leaf opened, Isildur awoke. One could say from now on the white tree was connected to Isildur's line. It looked grim in Númenor, and Amandil, who foresaw the end of Númenor, decided to do what Elrond's father Eärendil once did, as explained in part 1, to sail to Aman and ask for help. If he would not return and things became too grim, his son Elendil should leave with his family and the faithful. Amandil never returned and was never heard of again. We see many parallels to the First Age. Think of the Pride of Turgon and the Fall of Gondolin, but also several differences. Eärendil would return with a host of the Valar, Amandil did not. When Ar-Pharazôn set sail to claim immortality in Aman and came close to the coast, he even set foot on Aman claiming the land, the Valar were not pleased and called for Eru, that is God, who changed the shape of the world from flat to spherical, bending the ocean so that the flat world became a sphere. A great chasm opened under the sea from the coasts of Aman to Númenor, and everything was drawn down, including Ar-Pharazôn, his fleet, and the island of Númenor. It is said that the king and his men were buried under rocks and falling hills, and are imprisoned in a mysterious place called Caves of the Forgotten until the end of the world. Aman, including the island Tol Eressëa, were removed from the world out of the reach of men forever. In Lord of the Rings, we find a hint in the chapter The House of Tom Bombadil. When the elves passed westward, Tom was here already, before the seas were bent. So the idea of the seas being bent can be found in the Lord of the Rings too, and Tom could be considered a reliable source for this. For completeness' sake, Tolkien also worked on a version where Arda was always a sphere with some other changes, which is the so-called round world version, published in Morgoth's Ring. He abandoned this idea though and never finished it. That is why it did not make its way into the Silmarillion. I'm not the hugest fan of the round world version myself too. It's not even clear if Tolkien would have finished it at all. Here's a quote by Christopher Tolkien from Morgoth's Ring. It may be, though I have no evidence on the question one way or the other, that he, John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, came to perceive from such experimental writing as this text that the old structure was too comprehensive, too interlocked in all its parts, indeed its roots too deep to withstand such a devastating surgery. But let's return to the story, as Amandil did not come back. His son Elendil, who looked for the return of his father actively too, and his two grandsons Isildur and Anarion took their faithful people and many important items on their 9 ships, like the sapling of the white tree Nimlos, 7 Palantíri, once gifted to them by the elves from Aman, and the mentioned silver scepter of the lords of Andúnie. Also a star-shaped gem at this time, or maybe only later, called Elendilmir, which was originally owned by the mentioned Silmarillion, who did not become queen. She was the daughter of Tar Elendil, which might be an alternative explanation for the name of the gem. She was the mother of the first lord of Andúnie. Further, they took with them the Ring of Barad-dur, which was brought to Númenor, most likely by Elros, who received it from maybe Elrond's and Elros' mother Elwing, the great-granddaughter of Barad-dur. It then later went again into possession of Silmarillion and then of the lords of Andúnie. I assume they also took on their 9 ships the dwarven sword Narsil. How it got to Númenor is not mentioned at all. And last, a very big black spherical stone, which would become the Stone of Erech. That was not a Palantir, though in some early drafts of The Lord of the Rings it actually might have been one. There was a tower in Erech with a Palantir in it, which might be the stone, but that did not make it into the published version of The Lord of the Rings, where it's just a big mystical black stone sphere. It almost looks like the number 9 is the number of men, considering the Nazgûl were also 9 and here we had the 9 ships. As a longer side note, Narsil was described as Elendil's sword, but we don't know how he got into possession of it or what happened with it before. Not many notes exist about the sword at all. It was forged by the legendary dwarven smith Telchar, according to the Lord of the Rings chapter The King of the Golden Hall, and from the unfinished tales we know that Thingol, we talked about him in part 1, possessed swords forged by Telchar, but no names were recorded. Quote, "Now Thingol had in Menegros deep armories filled with great wells of weapons, metal wrought like fish's mail, and shining like water in the moon, swords and axes, shields and helms, wrought by Telchar himself or by his master, Gamil Zirak the Old, or by elven wrights more skillful still. My theory is that Narsil was among those weapons and later in possession of Dior too. Interestingly, it's a dwarven blade with an elven name. The name could have been given later, or it shows the good relationship between elves and dwarves of that time. It might have survived the second kinslaying. From there, it somehow got into, I assume, Elros' possession. Either it was taken with Elwing to the mouth of Sirion. Young Elwing, the mother of Elrond and Elros, was not the only survivor of Dorias, and they took the Silmaril with them too. Another option would be it was plundered during the fall of Doriath and maybe even used in the War of Wrath by someone, and again was given to Elros during this time or after it, maybe because he would have inherited Narsil and was its rightful owner, and only after the war matters like these could be sorted out. We don't know. That Elrond's brother Elros had this sword at all is also stated nowhere and just my own theory, that we also find elsewhere, for example on Tolkien Gateway. But we know it became the sword of Elendil, and this is one of the few ways how it could have gotten from Doriath, if it was there at all, to Númenor. Another possibility is that it was brought to Lindon after the war and then was given back to the king when Númenor and Lindon made contact again with each other. Maybe it was given to Elendil when he arrived in Lindon after the downfall of Númenor and it was never on the island at all. All of this is possible, but considering that many heirlooms were taken with the 9 faithful ships from Númenor to Middle-earth and that Narsil only got famous much later in the War of the Last Alliance, it might have been just an old sword that has seen very little use during the time in Númenor and is not mentioned in that time because of that. In this case, it would be interestingly again an heirloom of Silmarillion and the Lords of Andúnie. One could ask how they have gotten all those heirlooms, but to be fair, they were the only people that survived Númenor, were also direct descendants of Elros, and the later kings did not care too much about at least the elven gifts and artifacts. The Palantíri or Seeing Stones were, according to the Silmarillion, in addition a recent gift to Amandil by the elves and not an ancient heirloom like the Ring of Barad-dur. Quote, "These stones were gifts of the Eldar to Amandil, father of Elendil, for the comfort of the faithful of Númenor in the dark days when the elves might come no longer to that land under the shadow of Sauron." The Palantíri were, according to a statement of Gandalf from The Lord of the Rings, made by Fëanor, and at least one of them, the Master Stone, got somehow into possession of the Teleri in Aman, living on the island Tol Eressëa, who were victims of the first kingslaying. You might remember that from part 1. While the others were gifted to Númenor. It's likely that all Seeing Stones were in possession of the Teleri of Tol Eressëa, because they are mentioned to sail to Númenor, bringing gifts with them, according to the Silmarillion. Quote, "And they brought to Númenor many gifts, birds of song, fragrant flowers, and herbs of great virtue, and a seedling they brought of Celeborn, the white tree." Some might think of Kingsfoil or Athelas here too, which was brought to Middle-earth from Númenor, though it might have existed in Middle-earth too during the First Age, but it could have also been native to Númenor, planted there by the Vala of nature Yavanna. Interestingly, all those mentioned heirlooms have quite interesting connections. The Ring of Barad-dur was a gift of Finrod and a symbol of the house of Finarfin. Finarfin is Galadriel's and Finrod's father. As mentioned, the Palantíri were made by Fëanor. Narsil was a dwarven blade, probably possessed by Thingol, and Elros and Elrond were descendants of Thingol, but also of Turgon, who was the son of Fingolfin, the older brother of Finarfin. Fëanor, Fingolfin, and Finarfin were the 3 sons of Finwë, the first king of the Noldor, while Thingol was the first king of the Teleri. And Finwë's second wife, Indis, was the niece of Ingwë, the king of the Vanyar elves and king of all elves. It's quite interesting how all those lines of the elven kings are somehow connected to this bloodline and those heirlooms, at least to some degree. The white tree Nimloth of Númenor was once a seedling of the tree Celeborn, which again was a seedling of the tree Galadriel, which was made by the Vala of nature Yavanna in image of Telperion, one of the original and legendary 2 trees of Valinor. The light of some stars is related to Telperion, and the moon was made out of his last flower, while the sun was made out of the last fruit of his sister tree Laurelin. And the first rise of sun and moon was also the time when men awoke according to Tolkien's mythology. For example, the name Narsil itself, meaning red and white flame, references sun and moon too. Anar is Quenya for sun, Isil is Quenya for moon. The concept of sun and moon we will find later here and there too. For example, in the name Minas Ithil and Minas Anor, the latter one will be later known as Minas Tirith. I know that was quite a long side note, so allow me to add a short ad break here. Then we continue with what happened with Elendil and his two sons Isildur and Anarion after the destruction of Númenor. Maybe take time to hit the subscribe and like button. It can of course also happen that you don't see any ads for various reasons. But let us continue. The destruction of Númenor happened Second Age 3319. Elendil and his two sons escaped the downfall of Númenor, in which the island was swallowed by the ocean, on 9 ships. Elendil had 4 ships, Isildur 3 and Anarion 2. In the events of the downfall and maybe storms and heavy swell of the sea, Elendil's ships got separated from those of his two sons. Elendil was driven to Lindon, where Gil-galad helped him out and befriended him, and Isildur and his brother Anarion were driven down to the south, maybe somewhere around the faithful haven of Pelargir. They definitely explored the area and maybe sailed up some rivers too. In Lord of the Rings we find the note that they brought this mentioned giant perfectly spherical stone with them. This was the stone of Erech. Quote, "Unearthly it looked, as though it had fallen from the sky, as some believed, but those who remembered still the lore of Westerners told that it had been brought out of the ruin of Númenor and there set by Isildur at his landing." So it got there around Isildur's landing, maybe during an early exploration phase, because Erech is up the river Morthond, which is quite far away from Pelargir and seems like a very unusual place for a first landing. It of course can be reached by ship in theory, but no idea why Isildur would sail there initially, but he somehow sailed there probably early on and brought this stone with him, because I can't imagine him and his men carrying around this stone for long and hauled in the middle of nowhere close to the mountains. It was quite big, for upon the top stood a black stone, round as a great globe, the height of a man, though its half was buried in the ground. He later made the hillmen of that region swear an oath to fight with him against Sauron. This is the origin of the Oathbreakers, who of course broke the oath. Why this stone was placed there is hard to say. As mentioned in an early draft of Lord of the Rings, there was a tower in Erech, and maybe the stone of Erech was a Palantir itself at some point. In one version there was a tower mentioned in Erech with a Palantir in it, but it seems to me the stone of Erech is mentioned separately too. It's a bit confusing. See the book The War of the Ring, chapter Many Roads Lead Eastwards. So they might have not been the same. I assume it was some kind of symbol of the foundation of Isildur's and Anarion's kingdom, which was called Gondor, or a cornerstone showing the border to the hillmen. The hillmen of the White Mountains are very likely descendants of the Edain house of the Haladin from the First Age, of which a group settled there at some point during their escape from the Far East, while the rest moved on to Beleriand. See my video about Harles and the Haladin. However, the foundation of Gondor and the placing of the stone of Erech was around Second Age 3320. Elendil found Arnor in the north in parallel. My theory, I mentioned it in one of my live streams before, is that a stone like this is not easily crafted and demonstrates your advancement and knowledge as a civilization. Just moving this stone and placing it somewhere inland is already impressive and quite a statement, not to mention constructing it, distantly comparable to the pyramids, just as a small version. Considering a diameter of 2 meters, it not being hollow, and a density of granite of 2,700 kilograms per cubic meter, it would weight around 11 tons. It's massive. This also might have impressed the hillmen, and they swore their oath to Isildur upon it at some point during the beginning of the realm of Gondor, as we can read in the mentioned chapter. In Gondor, Osgiliath was created as capital with 2 thrones, one for each brother, because they ruled over Gondor together. Minas Ithil was residence of Isildur, where also the White Tree was planted, and Minas Anor, later known as Minas Tirith, was the residence of Anarion. Elendil went east of Lindon and, as mentioned, founded his kingdom Arnor there, Second Age 3320, with Anúminas being the capital. It is described in the Council of Elrond as a return of the kings of men to Middle-earth, which makes some sense. 4 of the 7 Palantíri went to Gondor and 3 to Arnor. The mentioned Elendilmir also became a symbol of the king of Arnor instead of a crown, and the silver scepter also became the scepter of Anúminas, another symbol of the kings in the north. Gondor used a Númenorian warhelm, initially maybe 2, as crown and symbol of their kings. The crown and Gondor itself was maybe inspired by ancient Egypt, according to Tolkien's letter 211. But it must also be mentioned that the king's men were not all gone. For example, in Umbar and maybe even other havens, there of course were still Númenorians not affected by the downfall of Númenor. Those king's men became known as Black Númenorians, and some might have still been close to Sauron and his teachings. It seems for the most part they lived in the far south and especially in Umbar. Sauron himself was surprised by the immense wrath of Eru and the Valar and feared what might come towards him. He knew that he single-handedly defeated Númenor and it would not become a threat ever again, but with the destruction of the island, also Sauron's body was destroyed. But he was a spirit being and simply returned like a shadow and a black wind with his one ring to Mordor. There he took a new form, which reflected his evil, and his Eye of Sauron the Terrible few could endure. We can read that he could not take a fair form, like that of Anatar, to the eyes of men ever again after this. About the elvish perspective we sadly have no information about. How did Gil-galad and Elrond perceive this change of the world and bending of the oceans? We can read in the Silmarillion that the destruction of Númenor caused floods in Middle-earth, some islands vanished, new islands appeared, and also inland a few things changed due to this event of unprecedented magnitude. We don't know how Elrond's relationship to his distant kin in Númenor was. Maybe he was worried and then happy to see Elendil appearing with 3 ships in Lindon. Could he foresee what happened in Númenor? I imagine that Elrond welcomed Elendil and was happy to see his distant relative, but he, Círdan and Gil-galad were probably troubled by Númenor not being around anymore. They probably knew it would not be the last time they heard about Sauron. It seems Lindon stayed mostly intact after these events. I could find no mention of, for example, flooded harbors there. We know Gil-galad and Elendil had a good diplomatic relationship, and we can also read that they were friends. It seems plausible that the High King of the Noldor allowed Elendil to settle in Eriador and found a new kingdom in exile, which was of course Arnor. Its capital was Anúminas and close to Lake Nenuyal, where Galadriel and Celeborn once lived for a time, as mentioned. The southern sister kingdom Gondor probably did not need a permission for the Dúnedain to settle there, even though there is the elvish harbour town Ethelond and the inhabited region of Dol Amroth. Dol Amroth was later also ruled by the Dúnedain, probably related to the lords of Andúnie, but it's not clear when. Of course, the foundation of Gondor could have pushed or pressured other men living in the southern regions. Let's talk a bit about Dol Amroth, which means Hill of Amroth. As mentioned, the character Amroth was in one version the son of Galadriel and ruler of Lothlorien, or in a later one the son of a new character called Amdir, who was the ruler of Lothlorien instead and Amroth his heir. The place Dol Amroth is named after the character and maybe got its name after his death in the Third Age. One ruler of Dol Amroth with the title Prince of Dol Amroth plays a role in the story of Lord of the Rings. That is of course Imrahil. According to the unfinished tales, Elendil gave the title of Prince of Dol Amroth, or maybe only the title Prince, to a faithful Númenorian who once settled in Dol Amroth, or all of Belfalas, which is the complete region, and Dol Amroth was just a part of it, I assume, even before the downfall of Númenor, and this unknown Númenorian built a stronghold there. The problem is now that the first Prince of Dol Amroth and even his oldest known ancestor were born around 2000 years later, which is strange if the title existed since the late Second Age. It's also unusual that Elendil gave the title, because this is Gondor, not Arnor. But Elendil was, according to Appendix A, High King of the Dúnedain in exile and just committed the rule of Gondor to his two sons. So I guess it makes sense. With this 2000-year gap, it is not 100% clear when Dol Amroth as realm of the Dúnedain was actually founded. Of course, Sindar elves already founded a dwelling place in this region around Belfalas after the War of Wrath. Interestingly, according to Lord of the Rings Appendix B, the potential death of Amroth himself and the vanishing of his lover Nimrodel happened Third Age 1981. So not in the Second Age, and one of the ancestors of the first Prince of Dol Amroth most likely married an elf maiden named Mithrellas, who was a companion of Nimrodel. Some believe it was Nimrodel herself. This must have been around this time too, and it is an important detail because in Lord of the Rings it's explained that the Prince of Dol Amroth had elven blood in his veins, which is noticed by Legolas. I have no good explanation or see a good way combining those information from these texts due to this strange 2000-year gap. Maybe the idea of the title Prince was a thing before, but it was only claimed after Amroth's death, or only then renamed in Prince of Dol Amroth, though the character Amroth never ruled over Dol Amroth, blocking the rule for a potential faithful Prince of Men. I assume it was named Dol Amroth after his death too. Still, the creation of the title and when the first prince lived and ruled there does not really fit chronologically into the Second Age at all. Also, in one version we find the hint that Amroth ruled Lorien in the Second Age, while Celeborn and Galadriel lived somewhere in this region in the south and probably ruled over it too. So why create the title Prince for that region at that time when powerful elves ruled there already? It's all quite strange chronologically. Maybe it's a mistake and instead of Elendil creating the title in the Second Age, King Eärnil II created it and gave the title to Galador, the first Prince of Dol Amroth in the Third Age. Would make more sense, and I guess these texts are just impossible to combine. However, if we return to our initial point considering the foundation of Gondor, it seems the arriving faithful from Númenor were at least welcomed in this region by the already settled faithful and maybe even the elves. Hence, Gondor could be founded there, and Osgiliath became capital of it, close to its foundation, I assume. It must be mentioned that with Pelargir, there was also another faithful Númenorian harbor city in that region. The foundation of Gondor could probably work without conflict because their fellow faithful people already lived there, and the faithful were elf friends too, living in peace with their elven neighbors, I assume. But you see, it's quite difficult to draw a coherent picture of this timeline with the notes we have, especially the work in progress ones. We also don't know how Gil-galad or Elrond interacted with those new established kingdoms of the Dúnedain in exile. I could imagine they visited them or were visited by the Dúnedain at some point for diplomatic reasons and exchanged messages in some way. It's hard to believe that Gondor was founded and they knew nothing about it, while knowing Sauron is still around. Gil-galad even knew about Sauron's activity in the Far East, and Elrond later ties the fate of Aragorn to become king of Gondor, though Elrond had probably a closer relationship to the kingdom of Arnor, which was his neighbor. We can also read in the Silmarillion that Gil-galad and Elendil were friends, which is a bit more than just an ally. As such, I see it as highly plausible that they at least would meet in person from time to time, while Gondor is of course quite far away from the elves, so if it happened, it I guess happened far less here. Rivendell was pretty much right at the borders of Arnor, and it guarded a pass over the Misty Mountains, so it was one possible route from Arnor to Gondor, or to the other side of the Misty Mountains, which was probably used by many travelers, and Elrond and Rivendell are known as very hospitable. We know that, for example, the Last Alliance took this route to travel to Gondor and Mordor, though the Gap of Rohan, which of course had a different name at this time, would have been a possible route too. Or that Isildur's family waited there for him to return from the War of the Last Alliance, though he was at that time still ruler of Gondor. So I can see how there was quite some exchange, especially in Rivendell. I could imagine that the elves also learned about what happened in Númenor in this time during their meetings with the Dúnedain. The topic of the world changing its form might have been of interest too, especially for Círdan as Marina. Interestingly, Elrond and as a result also Elendil were distant relatives of Gil-galad too. The idea that only all three peoples together can withstand Sauron was probably still in their minds. We remember how Gil-galad contacted Númenor in the past. We talked about the letter he sent to the Númenorian king, or how Galadriel expressed this too later, and Eregion allying and cooperating with the dwarves. I can't imagine that they all assumed that Sauron would be gone forever. As a result, a friendly and peaceful relationship with the others was still important. It is believed that, for example, Gil-galad built the white towers on the Emun Berait, the Tower Hills, for Elendil. Of course, the towers gave the hills their name, so they had a different name before, I assume. In the highest tower, called Elostirion, Elendil placed one of the Palantíri, the seeing stones. It could be used to see the Master Stone in the Tower of Avalone on the island Tol Eressëa in Aman. We know from the notes to the song about Elbereth in Tolkien's poem collection The Road Goes Ever On that elves would at least later travel there as some kind of pilgrimage, but it's not clear when exactly this tradition began, but it definitely existed in the Third Age. Maybe Gil-galad and Elrond had access to the Palantíri, or at least one of them too. The other Palantíri were placed in other towers. One, I assume the second biggest in Middle-earth, which could not be moved by one man, in Amon Sul, and one in the capital, Annúminas, for Arnor. In Gondor, the biggest one was placed in its capital, Osgiliath. One was placed in Orthanc in Isengard, a tower built by the Dúnedain out of an almost indestructible black stone, maybe similar to the outer wall of Minas Tirith. One, of course, in Minas Tirith, at this time still called Minas Anor, meaning Tower of the Sun, and the last in Minas Ithil, meaning Tower of the Moon, later known as Minas Morgul. We talked about sun and moon being referenced by the Dúnedain. And of course, the Master Stone was on the island Tol Eressëa in Aman. They were very powerful tools and used to communicate or even see distant places, even throughout time it seems. Especially communication between Arnor and Gondor was important, considering how far away they were from each other. We also see how much was built at this time. Depending on how you interpret the term Sea Kings, the Soothburg, that's Old English for, I assume, South Stronghold, later known as Hornburg or Hornburg, was probably built at that time. Quote from the chapter Helm's Deep from Two Towers. Men said that in the far-off days of the glory of Gondor, the Sea Kings had built here this fastness with the hands of giants. Interestingly, there is no Sindari name for the Hornburg, I think. The glittering caves were called Aglarond though. The Old English names indicate strongly it was called like that by the people of Rohan and their ancestors, but we only know them from the Third Age, and it must have had a different name when it was built. Sea Kings could mean Elendil and his sons. There's also a group of Gondorian kings who were known for their ship fleets and who expanded Gondor a lot, but they are called the Four Ship Kings in Appendix A. Interestingly, in an early version, Aglarond had a Palantir. I also assume that, for example, other famous constructions like the Argonas were built later. You could say Arnor and Gondor were growing and booming. It's hard to say how the elves perceived this extremely fast growth. Isildur and Anarion had children and grandchildren and people had peace, but that should change. Sauron in Mordor grew his power too, and for example beyond growing his orc armies, he recruited black Númenorians who fell for his evil during his time in Númenor, but also Haradrim and I assume Easterlings. We can read about the black Númenorians Herumor and Fuinur who rose to power among the Haradrim. Also, people saw the smoke of Orodruin from afar and perceiving that Sauron had returned. Orodruin was then called Mount Doom or Amon Amars in Sindarin, meaning the same. Orodruin means fiery red mountain. The Dark Lord was also not happy to see some survivors from Númenor, which he destroyed and hated, becoming his new neighbors, even establishing new realms. Quote from Appendix A. But his anger was great when he learned that Elendil, whom he most hated, had escaped him and was now ordering a realm upon his borders. It might be that around this time, probably a bit earlier, when Sauron's power grew again, the Dark Lord was threatening the south of Greenwood the Great, later known as Mirkwood. According to the unfinished tales, Oropher abandoned Amon Lang, which then became a ruin, and probably later in the Third Age Dol Guldur. But this is just a theory of mine, and as mentioned, canon of Oropher and even Amon Lang can be debated. And then, Second Age 3429, so 109 years after the foundation of Gondor and Arnor, Sauron made his move and attacked Minas Ithil. Maybe too early because Appendix A mentions his power was not fully rebuilt while the power of, for example, Gil-galad increased. Though Gondor alone had no chance. Sauron took the city and again burned the White Tree there, as in Númenor once, but history repeats itself, even in more details. Again, Isildur managed to save a sapling of the White Tree and escaped with it. The Dúnedain kingdoms should not end. We talked about how the line of the Númenorian kings should end with the White Tree Nimlos, and how Isildur's line was maybe tied to the new tree. We could also compare this to maybe Elwing escaping with an important heirloom, the Silmaril in the Nauglamir necklace, and maybe even the sword Narsil. Narrowly escaping death seems to be a thing for Elrond's and Elros' line. While Anarion defended Osgiliath against the invading forces of Sauron, Isildur, according to peoples of Middle-earth, fled with the sapling to Elendil. He sailed north up the Anduin with his wife and children by ship in this version, though the hint that he traveled up the Anduin is in Appendix B of Lord of the Rings as well. So he must have traveled over Elrond's realm Rivendell to reach Elendil. I assume Isildur's family stayed in Rivendell and then he traveled further and talked to his father. Further evidence for this is that in Rivendell also his youngest son Valandil was born. Elrond is only briefly mentioned in the timetable from Peoples of Middle-earth in the Heirs of Elendil section, but considering Isildur's root, Elrond was for sure an important figure in all these events and in what's coming next. Second Age 3430, around a year after Isildur escaped from Minas Ithil, the last alliance of elves and men is formed, and a large host of elves and men is mustered in Arnor according to Elrond in the Council of Elrond, and it was at the Tower of Amon Sul, or Weathertop, where Elendil stood watching for the host of Gil-galad coming from the west, where Lindon is, as we can read in the chapter A Knife in the Dark from the Lord of the Rings. Quote, "And they made the last alliance of elves and men, and the hosts of Gil-galad and Elendil were mustered in Arnor, and it is told that Elendil stood there on Amon Sul, watching for the coming of Gil-galad out of the west in the days of the last alliance." I could imagine they chose this place to meet and coordinate because this way they could stay in contact with Gondor using the Palantir of Amon Sul. Interestingly, there is no mention of what happened with the Palantir of Minas Ithil at this time. Remember, this is the Second Age. Only 3 things are possible in my opinion. Either Sauron got it and the Dunedain got it back after his defeat, or Isildur managed to hide it so well that Sauron could not find it for the 5 to 6 years it took the army of the Last Alliance to arrive in Gondor, or, the most plausible in my opinion, Isildur took it with him. As mentioned, according to the Peoples of Middle-earth, he escaped in a ship with his family and the White Tree Sapling, which really mirrors what happened in Númenor or the escape of Elwing from Doriath in the First Age, if you want. It's strange that the Seeing Stone is not mentioned, but maybe it was kept a great secret. It was most likely also a smaller stone. Only the stone of Amon Sul and Osgiliath were so large that they could not be lifted by a single man, which in my opinion indirectly implies that this was different for the other Seeing Stones. As a result, this theory makes most sense from my perspective, and maybe the Palantir was as a result briefly stored in Rivendell. Hard to say if Elrond knew about it, but it would make sense if true, but keep in mind that's just a theory of mine. There were for sure negotiations and planning going on. We can read in the Unfinished Tales that for the initial alliance, Elendil and Gil-galad swore an oath and even called Eru, that is God, to witness it. Calling Eru for an oath was something only the kings of Númenor were allowed to do. Quote, "It had been held lawful only for the kings of Númenor to call Eru to witness, and then only on the most grave and solemn occasions." Elendil was of course from the line of kings, and this was a very special situation which also showed the determination of elves and men. Now breaking the oath would have brought real consequences upon the oathbreaker. The source for this oath is a mention in the Unfinished Tales in the section about Cirion and Eorl, who also swore a similar oath at the secret grave of Elendil almost 2,500 years later. Quote, "Such an oath had not been heard in Middle-earth since Elendil himself had sworn alliance with Gil-galad, king of the Eldar." And Elrond was most likely a witness of this and also having a command. In the timetable we find in Peoples of Middle-earth in the chapter The Heirs of Elendil, which was the foundation for the Tale of Years from Appendix B, we can read Second Age 3340. The last alliance is begun. Elendil and Isildur obtain the help of Gil-galad and Elrond and gather great forces. The date was changed a bit later by Tolkien. So help is obtained from both Gil-galad in Lindon and Elrond in Rivendell. At this time the elves were not leaving Middle-earth to the same degree as in the Third Age, and they were still powerful. They used the time to build a massive army. Second Age 3431, so a year later if you consider the actual date from Lord of the Rings, Gil-galad and Elendil moved to Rivendell and only crossed the Misty Mountains from there Second Age 3343, so 2 years later. Anarion has to hold Osgiliath all this time alone. We know from the Third Age that Rivendell had a forge, and it would make sense it already had one in the Second Age, considering its role in the war. So one could assume that weapons and armor could have been produced there too. But I guess Lindon and the cities of Arnor produced those as well and maybe sent them there. We don't know how well Elrond's forces were equipped, but considering the origin story of Rivendell, probably well. Though it's hard to imagine how Rivendell becomes a place where armies prepare for war. I think the intention of the Last Alliance was originally to just defend Gondor, and after they noticed their strengths, they increased their goals to end Sauron once and for all, because they knew, as long as Sauron is there, peace won't last. It is an interesting thought, but they for sure hold councils in this time, and maybe the healer and lawmaster Elrond did tell them too. We cannot destroy it by any craft that we here possess. There lies our hope, if hope it be, to walk into peril to Mordor. We must send the ring to the fire. I guess it would have been wise to think about what to do if they win and how to destroy Sauron before marching into the battle itself. It's in a way a very interesting thought how history may have repeated itself here, and Elrond was there as witness and advisor. In a sense, it is possible that Elrond will hold a speech in the Third Age that was quite similar to one he held in the Second Age, with maybe the White Tree of Gondor in his garden and maybe a Palantir somewhere hidden in his backyard. It is possible that the tree was placed in Rivendell for a while. Even Glorfindel might have been present, and of course Círdan too, though at Elrond's council at the end of the Third Age, Círdan's messenger Galdor of the Havens is present instead of him. I find this thought quite amusing. In some texts we find the information that Gil-galad gifted his ring Vilya to Elrond at some point before his death, at the end of the War of the Last Alliance. Quote from Appendix B. Gil-galad, before he died, gave his ring to Elrond. In the Unfinished Tales, this happens during the council after the War of Sauron against Eregion around Second Age 1701, which seems plausible. When the Noldor king gave the ring Narya to his other close advisor Círdan is not 100% clear though, but I think camping in Rivendell for 3 years, planning, maybe thinking about dying in battle would be the last good opportunity for it. But we find another hint in the Unfinished Tales. Quote, at that time also Gil-galad gave Vilya the blue ring to Elrond and appointed him to be his vice regent in Eriador, but the red ring he kept until he gave it to Círdan when he set out from Lindon in the days of the Last Alliance. So it was probably not in Rivendell if you see those texts as canon, though Appendix B implied that Círdan received Narya when Gil-galad gets it from Celebrimbor. If Elrond and Círdan took it with them or hid it home is not known. For them the possibility of dying and losing the fight against Sauron existed too. If they would fail, it would be better if Sauron does not get his hands on 2 of the Elven Rings of Power, and because Sauron had the one ring, they didn't wear the rings anyway. Quote, but all that has been wrought by those who wield the 3 will turn to their undoing, and their minds and hearts will become revealed to Sauron if he regains the one. Another thing the elves probably have done in this time of preparation is sending messages to the other free peoples of Middle-earth announcing their plan to attack Sauron. The other option would be that the others found it out by themselves, which is possible too, I guess. However, they somehow learned about the existence of the Last Alliance, and we know that the Dwarves of Khazad-dûm, the elves of the Woodland realm under Thranduil, or his father Oropher, if you see him as canon, though Thranduil went to war either way, and the elves of Lórien under King Amdir, if you also see him as canon, joined the army of the Last Alliance of elves and men too, when it was close to their realms, I assume. Interestingly, as far as I know, Amroth is not mentioned joining in any text, neither is Celeborn, but I could imagine he fought in the war as well. Why they called it the Last Alliance is not clear too. Either ambition that after it Sauron is defeated forever and no other alliance like that will be ever needed again, or that when they fail, Sauron will win and an alliance like this can't be formed ever again, but I assume they were confident. After all this preparation, they formed a massive army. Elrond describes it like this. I remember well the splendor of their banners, he said. It recalled me to the glory of the elder days and the hosts of Beleriand. So many great princes and captains were assembled, and yet not so many nor so fair as when Thangorodrim was broken, and the elves deemed that evil was ended forever, and it was not so. The Silmarillion describes it similar. It is said that the host that was there assembled was fairer and more splendid in arms than any that has since been seen in Middle-earth, and none greater has been mustered since the host of the Valar went against Thangorodrim. And then, finally, Second Age 3434, the host of the last alliance crosses the Misty Mountains. Of course, Gil-galad was a Noldor king, and we learned about these ancient conflicts and the kingslayings in part 1. King Oropher with his son Thranduil and King Amdir, let's consider them canon for now, did not want to cooperate with the Noldor nor be under their command. But they knew that only without Sauron there can be peace, and so both kings put this ancient conflict aside and, as said, joined the host of the last alliance. Durin's folk from Moria joined them as well, and also the Dwarves had an ancient conflict with some of the Elven clans, and the Elven clans with them. Less with the Noldor, but with the Sindar elves like Thranduil, Oropher and Amdir. On one side, it's nice to see that they put aside their conflicts for the greater good. On the other side, this shows how the power of evil works, that even after thousands of years, these ancient conflicts were still a thing, and we will see the fruit of this in a moment. I also see this as power of Morgoth. According to Tolkien's letter 144, Sauron started fires in the woods that the host had to pass to slow them down. This also hit the Entwives that lived there. Quote, I think that in fact the Entwives had disappeared for good, being destroyed with their gardens in the War of the Last Lines, Second Age 3429 to 3441, when Sauron pursued a scorched earth policy and burned their land against the advance of the allies down the Anduin. They survived only in the agriculture transmitted to men and hobbits. Some, of course, may have fled east or even have become enslaved. Tyrants, even in such tales, must have an economic and agricultural background to their soldiers and metalworkers. If any survived so, they would indeed be far estranged from Ents, and any rapprochement would be difficult unless experience of industrialized and militarized agriculture had made them a little more anarchic. I hope so, I don't know. Quite interesting. I love how Tolkien adds so many little details to this and connects them with others. These lands are known as the Brown Lands afterwards. So devastating was the evil fire of Sauron that it never recovered and remained desolated, and the Entwives were lost too. Treebeard explains this as well in the chapter Treebeard in Lord of the Rings. This might have slowed them down, but did not stop them. But keep in mind, Anarion had to hold Osgiliath the whole time alone, and we can read in the Silmarillion, in the chapter of the Rings of Power and the Third Age, that he managed to push Sauron back for some time, so that the Dark Lord needed to regroup with, I assume, new reinforcements. Quite impressive by the Gondorians, though, as mentioned, Sauron started his attack too early and was not yet at full strength. Anarion also knew that he could not hold out forever, and that sooner or later he would lose without help. And it probably has been at this time that the host of the last alliance arrived. What was this for a feeling, knowing you would try to conquer Mordor, a thing that usually does not happen? Númenor would have, but Sauron surrendered before there could be a battle. Elrond, as herald and vice-regent of Gil-galad, likely had a big role when it comes to commanding all those forces, same as Círdan as close advisor of the king. Círdan himself was also a Teler and a Sindar if you want, and Elrond was related to Thingol, the first king of the Sindar, so they probably also had a better standing with the other Sindar and Nandor elves compared to the Noldor themselves, which might have been useful on the journey to Mordor, though in battle Gil-galad would lead. They all went through or around the burnt and desolated lands, later known as Brownlands, to the plains of Dagorlad, which means battle plain. Maybe it got this name after the upcoming battle, which happened in front of the Morannon, the Black Gate. I assume Sauron had to retreat from attacking Gondor and return to Mordor to defend his front door. It is possible that the last alliance arrived exactly at the time when Sauron was, as mentioned, pushed back by Gondor's forces and was retreating to regroup. Anarion also joined the last alliance with his forces, and then the legendary battle of Dagorlad broke out. We can read in the Silmarillion. All living things were divided in that day, and some of every kind, even of beasts and birds, were found in either host, save the elves only. They alone were undivided and followed Gil-galad. Of the dwarves, few fought upon either side, but the kindred of Durin of Moria fought against Sauron. This mentions that even some dwarves also fought on Sauron's side. How does this work? Didn't we learn that Sauron could not corrupt the dwarves using the Rings of Power? First, the dwarves of Moria, which are the ones we know best, are excluded from this anyway. Second, even in the Hobbit there is a mention of wicked dwarves, quote from the chapter Overhill and Underhill. In some parts, wicked dwarves had even made alliances with them, the goblins. So the idea of dwarves who ally with orcs, goblin is in my opinion usually a synonym for orc, seems to be very old. It's already in the first edition of The Hobbit. In the book The Lost Road and Other Writings, in an old version of the mythology from around 1937 or even older, we find an interesting quote. Iron they, the dwarfs, wrought rather than gold and silver, and the making of weapons and of mail was their chief craft. They aided the gnomes, the Noldor, greatly in their war with the orcs of Morgoth, but it is not thought that they would have refused to smithy also for Morgoth if he had need of their work or had been open to their trade. Gnomes was the name of the Noldor elves in early works. Also in Peoples of Middle-earth we find a small hint, it was only a footnote in the manuscript, that also some of the dwarves might have fallen under the shadow of Morgoth. Quote from the chapter of Dwarves and Men, written much later by Tolkien, around 1969. Alas, it seems probable that, as men did later, the dwarves of the far eastern mansions and some of the nearer ones came under the shadow of Morgoth and turned to evil. So some dwarves might have simply worked for Sauron for profit and got on his side this way, even though it were not rings that corrupted them, and maybe there were also some dwarves that lived under Morgoth's and Sauron's influence since the First Age. As always, how canon you see those notes is a different story, though what we find in The Hobbit can be considered pretty canon. However, independent of that, it seems the idea of some dwarves working for Morgoth, or later Sauron, existed for a very long time in small notes of Tolkien, and it also made it into the Silmarillion. I found a hint on Tolkien Gateway that this section from the Silmarillion called Of the Rings of Power and the Third Age was composed in parts out of information that did not make it into the published version of the Council of Elrond from Lord of the Rings. You definitely see the similarities between some sentences that Elrond says in Lord of the Rings and what we can read in this section of the Silmarillion. A fascinating little detail. However, now the Battle of Dagorlad started, and here the mentioned old conflict of Noldor and Sindar, through for example the kinslayings, still had an effect. We have to keep in mind that though committed by the Noldor, they were induced by Sauron's master Morgoth, who influenced Feanor and who stole the 3 Silmarilli from him and killed his father Finwë. This resulted in the Oath of Feanor, which became a powerful cursed fate that influenced the events of the complete First Age. Even now, at the very end of the Second Age, parts of this still have consequences. And so, according to the Unfinished Tales, Oropher, Thranduil's father and Amdir, king of Lorien, in some texts he is called Mal-galad, he and his army followed Oropher in combat, did not want to be under the supreme command of a Noldor king and ordered their armies of Sylvan elves, they are Nandor and maybe some Sindar, Thranduil was among them too, to charge towards the enemy before High King Gil-galad ordered to attack together and I assume according to the battle plan. In addition, the elves of the Woodland realm and Lothlorien were not as well equipped as, for example, the Noldor. This started the battle and led to some chaos. A lot of deaths could have been prevented otherwise. Oropher was riding ahead of his most fearless warriors but died in the first assault. Amdir and more than half his following was cut off from the main host and driven into the region that will be later known as the Dead Marshes. See my video about the Dead Marshes, where he and his army perished. You can probably imagine why it was called Dead Marshes, and we see the remnants of this ancient battle there during Lord of the Rings. We can read in the Unfinished Tales, Oropher had the wisdom to foresee that peace would not return unless Sauron was overcome, but in the end he did not foresee how to prevent his own doom. I think it would have been possible. Still, keep in mind that only Thranduil is a canon character and he survived the war. The battle still turned in Gil-galad's and Elendil's favor. We can read in the Silmarillion and find a similar wording in the Council of Elrond. Against Aeglos, the spear of Gil-galad none could stand, and the sword of Elendil filled orcs and men with fear, for it shone with the light of the sun and of the moon, and it was named Narsil. We discussed Narsil a bit already. This indicates that it might have gotten its name here, and as we learned, the name references sun and moon. Also, somewhere in this battle, Elrond fought at the side of Gil-galad and Elendil. We all know the epic intro of Lord of the Rings. At the end, the last alliance was victorious, and Sauron retreated and hid in his chief fortress Barad-dur, meaning Dark Tower. How long this battle lasted, I could not find a reliable source on, but the battle started Second Age 34-34, and the next phase also started Second Age 34-34, which is the Siege of Barad-dur. I imagine that one does not simply walk into Mordor, even if Sauron has retreated, and that getting into a position of being able to siege Sauron has taken some time too, and must have happened in the same year. Usually you don't fight during winter too. As a result, I don't think the battle lasted for 6 months or something. Gollum says in Lord of the Rings in the chapter The Passage of the Marshes, they fought on the plain for days and months at the Black Gates. He explains he learned the story of this battle when he was young, but that was still over 2,400 years later. Hard to say if it is an exaggeration of those victorious that is retold over generations or a fact. The siege of Gondor and the battle of the Pelennor fields lasted only a few days in comparison. Another detail of this battle is that the helmet Isildur wore there and in the war would later be made into a crown, which became the crown of Aragorn or King Elessar. The last alliance continued and went through the Black Gate into Mordor and besieged the Dark Tower of Sauron for 7 years. Similar to Orthanc, it was probably almost indestructible, and its foundation could not be undone as long as the One Ring existed. And one can assume that the Dúnedain knew how to build advanced siege weapons and what weakness a material like this could have had. As said, they built Orthanc, maybe out of a similar material. The siege for sure had its challenges and even cost lives. Second Age 34-40, so 6 years into the siege, Elendil's son and Isildur's brother Anarion was slain. A footnote from Appendix A in Lord of the Rings that also mentions Isildur's helm made into a crown later explains why Anarion's helm was not used for this. Quote, For the helm of Anarion was crushed by the stone cast from Barad-dur that slew him. So he was slain by a rock that Barad-dur threw at the last alliance. If even Anarion, a king of Gondor, was slain like this, one can imagine that other soldiers of the last alliance were slain in a similar way too. It was for sure hard to besiege in a hostile environment like Mordor as well, and that is probably why the siege lasted 7 years. Then, Second Age 3441, Sauron decided to fight and come forced to free himself from the siege. He for sure did not come out alone, and we see another battle in front of Barad-dur. Something similar we see in the intro of the Lord of the Rings film, though there we don't really see many signs of a siege. Again, Gil-galad, Elrond, Círdan, Elendil and Isildur fought side by side, and at some point Gil-galad and Elendil clashed with Sauron himself. Keep in mind, the eye of Sauron the Terrible few could endure, or as we can read in the Silmarillion, and the malice of the eye of Sauron few even of the great among elves and men could endure. How Sauron looked exactly is not known. We can read about his black hand, quote, Sauron's hand, which was black and yet burned like fire. The depiction in the film, as mentioned in a lot of my videos already, seems to be distantly inspired by Morgoth, who was known to wear a black armor, a terrible mace and a black crown with the 3 Silmarilli in it. We see this in the film depiction of Sauron minus a Silmarilli. According to the audio commentary, Sauron's helmet was somewhat inspired by a horse skull, I think. I also think it communicates the situation well, though in the books Sauron is a necromancer or a dark sorcerer, not a mace-wielding warrior like we see in Peter Jackson's film. In letter 246 we can read, Sauron should be thought of as very terrible. The form that he took was that of a man of more than human stature, but not gigantic. In the end, Gil-galad and Elendil could endure his eye. The quote from the text of Isildur of Sauron's black hand continues. The heat of Sauron's hand, which was black and yet burned like fire, and so Gil-galad was destroyed. Gil-galad was killed by Sauron with fire, it seems. It is said by Aragorn, Sauron can put fire to his evil uses as he can all things. And also Elendil was slain and his sword broke under him as he fell, but Sauron was thrown down too. I assume that means the Dark Lord was defeated as well, and Isildur with the hilt shard of Narsil cut off the finger with a one ring, maybe as a finishing blow before he could recover. We can read that Elrond said, I beheld, so he saw it with his own eyes as a witness. It must have been a huge moment of victory, but also a sad one that demanded many sacrifices. What exactly happens in this fight with Sauron at the end is very vague. Quote, I beheld the last combat on the slopes of Orodruin, where Gil-galad died and Elendil fell and Narsil broke beneath him, but Sauron himself was overthrown, and Isildur cut the ring from his hand with the hilt shard of his father's sword and took it for his own. What does overthrown or throw down, as it's phrased in the Silmarillion, mean? For sure it means Sauron was defeated, unable to make any moves in this state or position. In the German translation the word überwältigen is used, which could be translated with to overwhelm somebody or even to subdue. It also states that the battle took place at the slopes of Orodruin. In the film we see a big explosion after Isildur cuts off all his fingers of the hand with a ring, but that is not described in the books. There it's in addition only one specific finger which has the one ring that was cut off, and we also find no hint of an explosion. In the Silmarillion we can read, Then Sauron was for that time vanquished, and he forsook his body, and his spirit fled far away and hid in waste places, and he took no visible shape again for many long years. In Peoples of Middle-earth we find a note that the blue wizards tried to find Sauron's hiding place in the distant east after this event, at least in the version where they arrived in Middle-earth in the Second Age with Glorfindel. Quote, and after his first fall to search out his, Sauron's hiding, in which they failed, and to cause dissension and disarray among the Dark East. A quite interesting idea of Tolkien. We find another interesting detail regarding Elrond and the others in Lord of the Rings. Quote, Isildur took it as should not have been. It should have been cast then into Orodruin's fire nigh at hand where it was made, but few marked what Isildur did. He alone stood by his father in that last mortal contest, and by Gil-galad only Círdan stood, and I, Elrond, but Isildur would not listen to our counsel. I'm not 100% sure how to understand in that last mortal contest, but in my opinion the text indicates that Isildur was close to his dead or dying father, which is plausible considering that he was there to cut off the ring, but it also implies that Elrond and Círdan were close to their king too, maybe during combat, but also to the dead body. Elrond has served under Gil-galad for around 3,400 years, same with Círdan, and Gil-galad trusted him, making him his vice-regent. They most likely had a good relationship. Now his king was lying dead in front of him, burned by Sauron's fire. But he had no time to grieve. The next sentence implies that now was time for counsel. They advised Isildur to cast the One Ring into the fires of Mount Doom, so that it would be undone, but he would not listen to their counsel. We can also read in Appendix B that the ring race went into shadow. Them participating is not directly mentioned, but considering this mention, they were for sure active in the war as well. Maybe this moment was the saddest one. All could have ended here, but it did not. Elrond later talks about fruitless victories in his council during the Third Age, and I guess this is what he meant. The friends Elendil and Gil-galad died side by side in combat and managed to defeat Sauron, sacrificing themselves, but in the end, Sauron's evil could not be undone because the last step was missing. Elrond and Círdan were wise and had the gift of foresight. They probably knew best what this would lead to. And in addition, we can read, but few marked what Isildur did. Not many knew what he did, who said, This I will have as wergild for my father and my brother. And so he kept it as an heirloom. With the defeat of Sauron, the Second Age ended and the Third Age began. Mordor was conquered and under control of the winners. Gondor made fortresses and watched over the land of the Dark Lord. The places where soldiers were stationed were the Morannon, the Black Gate, which also got two towers, the Towers of the Teeth, Narhost and Karhost, the fortress Durthang, that means Dark Oppression, and the Tower of Cirith Ungol. They also tried to destroy Barad-dur, which worked to some degree, but the foundations of the Dark Tower could not be destroyed because they were bound to the One Ring, a sign that probably confirmed what Elrond and Círdan feared. Sauron might be gone for now, but the foundation of evil is still there and it will return one day. From the film and the beginning, we remember Elrond shouting with such an expression of despair in his face, Isildur! You maybe now have a better understanding why this might have been fitting, though it is not mentioned in the books like this. And with the end of the Second Age, we also reach the end of the second part of this video. Don't worry, the Third Age also has tons of details to discuss. Thank you for watching. That was long. I really hope you enjoyed the video and that I could provide you a very complete picture of the Second Age and Elrond, even with some information and connections in the lore you probably were not aware of. I think the Third Age part will be split into multiple parts because making 2+ hour long videos is really demanding and not healthy for my channel. The video alone is like 14 videos in one. After 2 very good months, November was a pretty bad one for my channel view-wise. I hope people are excited for the Third Age and Elrond. So what is next? I might release one not Tolkien related video here on this channel next as one of those rare exceptions, and maybe even one Tolkien related one that is not part 3 first. There will also be lore Q&A streams. I also already wrote a review for the gaming channel, I just need time to produce it. Very important change to my channel, gaming related videos, if not Tolkien related, will be released on my second channel. This channel here is Tolkien only, with occasional exceptions. If you are into that and want to support this channel, feel free to subscribe here. My subscriber rate is pretty bad. Like 90% of my views are from people who are not subscribed, which is a bit unfortunate. As always, recommend me further, leave a comment and maybe press the like button. I would really appreciate some feedback. I might produce a new episode of the Lord of the Rings book analysis and film differences series in between the next parts of this video too. It will definitely come back after this long journey with Elrond though. Looking forward to return to a more frequent upload schedule again, but I also want to tackle some other big topics next, like Dwarves, Galadriel, the Rings of Power and so on. If you still look for more, I also stream Playing Games Bad on Twitch and I plan to produce more podcast episodes. There also might be an update video because I recently had an interesting idea and maybe there will be another collaboration with other Tolkien lore YouTube channels. Again, thank you for watching and goodbye.